They humiliated the black CEO on the plane, then the entire airline instantly paid the price. "I don't care what your ticket says. I am not giving up this seat." The cold voice sliced through the stillness of first class like a blade. Crystal champagne flutes trembled slightly as the words landed, disrupting the carefully curated silence of luxury air travel. Have you ever been denied something that was rightfully yours? Something you paid for, earned, or deserved only to watch someone else claim it through sheer entitlement? Before I reveal what happened next, drop your city in the comments below. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when others tried to push you aside, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. What you're about to witness isn't just about an airline seat. It's about dignity. It's about what happens when the wrong person is pushed too far. And trust me, the next 45 minutes will change how you see air travel forever. Today's story begins on Skylink Flight 1847 from New York to Los Angeles. The date, October 15th. The time, 8:27 a.m., and the man who had just been told his seat wasn't his was about to teach everyone on that plane what true power looks like. Alexander. Alex Blackwood, 43, stood motionless in the aisle, boarding pass clutched firmly in his hand. His simple navy blazer and white button-down projected quiet confidence rather than flashy wealth. The boarding pass clearly showed Seat 1A, a window seat in the first row that he had booked 3 weeks ago after closing a $500 million acquisition. His tired eyes took in the cabin's warm lighting and the classical music playing through hidden speakers. After 7 grueling days of negotiations across 3 cities, he had specifically chosen this seat for the privacy it would offer on his journey home. But when Alex reached row 1, he paused. Someone was already seated by the window, his window with an air of absolute entitlement. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I believe you're in my seat." "I am 1A. He held out his boarding pass, the seat number clearly visible. The cabin's soft murmur of conversation momentarily paused like an orchestra missing a beat. Victoria Reynolds, 46, looked up from her magazine with practiced disdain. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in a sleek bob that spoke of a $500 salon appointment. Diamond studs sparkled in her ears, and a blazing red Hermes Birkin bag sat possessively on the empty aisle seat beside her. "This is my seat," she said dismissively. "I always sit here." She barely glanced at the boarding pass Alex still held extended. "I'm sorry, but my ticket says otherwise." Alex replied, his tone still pleasant but firm. "I specifically booked 1A 3 weeks ago." Victoria turned a page in her Vogue magazine and sighed. "Look, I'm a Gold Elite member. I've flown this route dozens of times. The crew knows me." Her fingers adorned with several large rings flicked dismissively. "There are plenty of other seats available. Find one of those." Around them, passengers watched with uncomfortable fascination. A man in row 2 leaned toward his wife and whispered, just loud enough to be heard. "Here we go again. Another delay because someone can't follow simple instructions." The whispers began to spread. Why doesn't he just find another seat? First-class problems, I guess. He doesn't really look like he belongs here anyway. Victoria smiled thinly at the murmurs drawing strength from them. In her mind, the situation was already decided. She had claimed the territory, and possession was all that mattered. What no one knew was that Victoria's confidence masked a deep insecurity. Having clawed her way up from a middle-class background to her position as senior partner at a prestigious law firm, she had learned early that appearing powerful was half the battle. She had been overlooked and underestimated throughout her career, something that drove her to seize every advantage earned or not. "If you'd like to call a flight attendant," she said with false sweetness, "feel free. But I assure you they'll tell you the same thing." Alex stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He had encountered this situation before, the assumption that he didn't belong, that he should step aside for someone else's comfort. The difference was that today he had no intention of moving an inch. Alex maintained his calm exterior while his mind processed the familiar scenario unfolding before him. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at his skin color and casual attire and made assumptions about where he belonged. 20 years ago, as a business school student flying economy on a scholarship-funded trip, he'd been repeatedly asked to show his boarding pass by flight attendants who seemed certain he was in the wrong seat. 15 years ago, as a junior executive, he'd been mistaken for waitstaff at a corporate gala despite his designer suit. 10 years ago, as a successful investment director, he'd been stopped by security when entering his own office building after hours. Each time he had remained dignified, had proven himself, had worked twice as hard to be considered half as worthy. That approach had served him well as he climbed from middle-class roots in Baltimore to becoming the founder and chairman of Blackwood Global Investments, a company now worth billions. His mother, a high school English teacher who raised him alone after his father died, had taught him to stand firm in his truth without losing his composure. "They'll try to make you angry," Shed said. "Don't give them that power. Your dignity is not negotiable." Alex had deliberately chosen to dress simply today. No custom suit, no luxury watch, no visible markers of his wealth. Part of it was personal preference, but it was also a test. He had been hearing disturbing reports about treatment disparities on Skylink flights, an airline his company had recently acquired a controlling interest in. So today he traveled as Alexander Blackwood passenger, not as the chairman who could fire everyone on this plane with a single phone call. The results so far were both unsurprising and deeply disappointing. With that clarity, he prepared for what came next, knowing this was no longer just about a seat. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in a space they had every right to occupy. What's even more important, he had spent years secretly developing Protocol 7, a comprehensive response system designed for exactly this type of discrimination. He hoped never to use it, especially on his own airline, but he wouldn't hesitate if necessary. Jessica Palmer, 34, moved down the aisle with practiced efficiency, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, her navy uniform pressed to perfection. Her professional smile faltered slightly when she assessed the situation, the elegantly dressed woman she recognized and the tall black man in casual clothes standing in the aisle. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. Her body already angled toward Victoria, her question clearly directed at the seated passenger. "This gentleman seems to think he has my seat," Victoria replied with exaggerated patience. Jessica turned to Alex. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass, please?" Alex handed it to her without a word. Jessica glanced at it, frowned slightly, then turned back to Victoria. "Ms. Reynolds, would you mind if I see your boarding pass as well?" Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "I don't need to show it. You know me, Jessica. I've sat in 1A dozens of times." Jessica hesitated, then turned back to Alex. Her voice lowered to what she clearly thought was a helpful tone. "Sir, to avoid any further inconvenience, would you be willing to accept a seat in business class? We can provide a refund and offer complimentary drinks." The subtle implication was clear. You should be grateful for business class. You don't really belong here anyway. Alex's voice remained steady. I purchased seat 1A and I will sit in seat 1A. The solution isn't for me to accept a downgrade. The solution is for the person in my seat to move to their assigned seat. Sir, Ms. Reynolds is one of our most valued customers and I'm not? Alex interrupted. Is my ticket somehow less valid than hers? Jessica glanced nervously down the aisle, clearly hoping for backup. The whispers around them grew louder. Why is he making such a fuss? Just take the business class seat. Some people just want to cause problems. Victoria settled back in the seat, Alex's seat, with a smug smile. She picked up her magazine again, a clear dismissal of both Alex and the situation. Sir, please. We're trying to be reasonable here. Alex met her gaze directly. There's nothing reasonable about asking the person with the correct seat assignment to give it up. If you're unwilling to check both boarding passes, then perhaps we need to involve your supervisor." Jessica's face flushed. She turned and hurried toward the front galley, speaking urgently into her handheld radio. Alex remained standing in the aisle perfectly still, his boarding pass still in hand. Around him, the whispers continued, but he focused on his breathing, on staying centered in his purpose. This was no longer about comfort during a 6-hour flight. This was about principles that could no longer be compromised. And little did they know, but Protocol 7 was about to change everything. Michael Hernandez, 41, moved with the confidence of someone who had handled 1,000 in-flight disputes. His gray-peppered hair was neatly trimmed, his uniform adorned with the 3 stripes of a chief purser. Jessica stood slightly behind him, her distress evident in her rigid posture. "Good morning," Michael began, his voice carrying smooth authority. "I understand we have a seating issue." Before Alex could respond, Victoria interjected. "Michael, good to see you again." Her tone implied familiarity, shared history. "This gentleman seems confused about the seating arrangements." Michael nodded toward Victoria with a smile that confirmed their acquaintance. "Ms. Reynolds, always a pleasure." Then he turned to Alex, his expression shifting to something more formal. "Sir, I understand there's some confusion about seat 1A. "There's no confusion," Alex replied calmly. "My boarding pass assigns me to seat 1A. I'd like to sit in my assigned seat." Michael adopted what he clearly thought was a diplomatic tone. "I understand, sir. However, Ms. Reynolds is one of our long-standing Gold Elite members. For years, we've prioritized her comfort on these transcontinental flights." Around the cabin, a few passengers nodded as though Michael's words had transformed Victoria's act into a legitimate privilege. Alex let out a soft, cold laugh. "Gold Elite." His voice lowered just enough that everyone had to listen carefully. "I'm Diamond Elite, and I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want to sit in the seat I paid for." Michael's face stiffened. He hadn't expected this simply dressed man to outrank Victoria in status. For a fleeting moment, hesitation crossed his face, but years of habit kicked in, and he turned back to Victoria. "Mom, would you kindly present your boarding pass, just to clarify the situation?" Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Michael, don't be ridiculous. I've sat in this seat dozens of times. You all know me. No paperwork needed." Alex studied their reactions closely. Anger pulsed through him, not because of the seat itself, but because the crew's bias was now on full display. "Mr. Blackwood," Michael said, his voice soft but edged with authority, "I believe we can find a reasonable solution. There's a seat available in business class, and we're willing to offer compensation. Please understand we must consider all passengers on this flight." Alex felt the truth crystallize. This man wasn't standing for what was right. He was standing for the blonde woman in seat 1A. He gripped his boarding pass tighter, his voice cutting through the cabin, deliberate and unyielding. "The only reasonable solution is for her to vacate my seat." The murmurs behind him grew louder. A man in row 2 muttered in frustration, "For God's sake, it's just a seat. Does it really need to be such a spectacle?" The words poured fuel on the smoldering fire. Victoria leaned back into the seat, his seat satisfied as the crowd began tilting toward her side. Alex swallowed hard. Memories crashing back, dinners where he was overlooked, meetings where his ideas were dismissed until repeated by a white colleague. Every slight and every dismissal converged on this moment when he, a man who had paid fairly like anyone else, was treated as if he didn't belong. Locking eyes with Michael, his voice dropped low and commanding. "If you truly want to resolve this, start with the most basic step. Ask her to show her boarding pass." The words struck like an unexpected counterpunch. For a split second, Michael and Jessica faltered. They had blatantly ignored the simplest protocol, checking both passengers' tickets. Mr. Blackwood, please cooperate. This is not the time to make things complicated. Alex smiled, sharp as a blade. Complicated. You call asking for proof. Complicated, or is it complicated because you fear the truth won't support the person you're protecting? The cabin erupted with stunned silence. Passengers stared wide-eyed. Some nodded subtly, beginning to sense the absurdity of the crew's actions. For a fleeting moment, Victoria's smug mask cracked uncertainty flashing in her eyes. The tide was beginning to turn, and Alex knew this was only the beginning. Victoria Reynolds had spent a lifetime being catered to, but what most didn't know was how hard-won that position had been. As the daughter of a small-town bank teller who'd put herself through law school waiting tables, she'd learned that power wasn't given, it was taken. Now, as a senior partner at Blackwell and Turner Law, she'd built her career on intimidation and privilege. Watching that foundation tremble even slightly triggered something primal in her. She leaned forward, her voice lowered to a register she reserved for courtroom maneuvers when the facts weren't on her side. "I don't appreciate being interrogated on a flight I take weekly," she said, addressing Michael while pointedly ignoring Alex. "This entire situation is making me uncomfortable." She emphasized the last word carefully. The subtle code was clear, claiming discomfort was often the first step toward having another passenger removed. "Michael," she continued, her voice honey smooth, "you know I value Skylink's service. That's why I've remained loyal despite competing offers." The implied threat hung in the air. "My business is conditional on how you handle this." She opened her red Hermes bag just enough to make its logo visible to everyone watching, then pretended to search for something. The bag itself was a statement. "I am wealthy. I belong here. He does not." "I seem to have misplaced my boarding pass," she said with practiced helplessness. "But surely that's not a problem for a regular customer." A woman in 3B whispered to her companion, "I've seen her on these flights before, always in first class." Victoria seized on this immediately. "You see, the other passengers recognize me." Alex remained motionless, watching this performance with the analytical eye of someone who had observed manipulation tactics in 1,000 business negotiations. "That's not how assigned seating works," Alex said quietly. "Recognition doesn't override ticket verification." Victoria's eyes flashed with momentary anger before she recalibrated. She turned to the other passengers, her expression a perfect mask of exasperated patience. "I apologize to everyone for this delay," she announced to the cabin at large. "Some people simply don't understand how things work in first class." The implication was unmistakable. "He doesn't belong here." "I do." Several passengers nodded in agreement, eager to get the flight underway. Others looked uncomfortable, beginning to sense the underlying currents of bias. Inside, Victoria felt a pang of recognition. Early in her career, she'd been the outsider, the woman told to wait her turn while male colleagues moved ahead. She'd been dismissed and underestimated, forced to fight for every inch of progress. The irony that she now wielded the same weapons of exclusion wasn't entirely lost on her, but she'd convinced herself this was different. This was protecting what she'd earned. Victoria returned her attention to Michael, lowering her voice confidentially. "This is becoming disruptive. The other passengers clearly want to depart." She was building the narrative that Alex was the problem, the disruptor, the outsider, the one who needed to be removed. And she was doing it without ever directly mentioning his race, allowing implicit bias to do the work for her. Alex watched it all unfold with a deepening resolve. This was exactly the behavior his Protocol 7 had been designed to address, not just overt discrimination, but the sophisticated, plausibly deniable bias that permeated every level of service. For 20 years, he had navigated spaces like this, watching the Victoria Reynoldses of the world claim what wasn't theirs while expecting him to step aside graciously. For 20 years, he had built his power quietly, waiting for the right moment. That moment had arrived. Captain Richard Bennett, 52. Emerged from the cockpit, his silver-streaked temples and 4 gold stripes commanding immediate respect. His presence altered the cabin atmosphere instantly. He stopped at the first row, surveying the scene with practiced calm. His gaze swept across Victoria, noting her elegant attire and confident posture before settling on Alex with unmistakable judgment in his eyes. "Sir," his voice resonated with unquestioned authority, "we have over 200 passengers waiting to depart. I need you to cooperate with my crew and resolve this matter immediately." The word cooperate fell heavily, an order thinly disguised as a request. "I'm more than willing to cooperate," Captain Alex replied evenly. "I simply want to sit in the seat I paid for. Seat 1A. Murmurs rippled through first class. A woman in row 2 sighed dramatically. "Honestly, does he really have to be so stubborn?" Captain Bennett seized on the comment, lowering his voice to address Alex directly. "Mr. Blackwood, my crew has offered several reasonable alternatives. Your continued refusal is now delaying this flight." He paused, then added with unmistakable gravity, "I have the authority under federal aviation regulations to remove any passenger whose actions threaten the safety or timely departure of this flight." The cabin fell silent, the threat hanging in the air. Alex felt dozens of eyes on him, irritated, impatient judging. He was being transformed from victim to villain in a matter of minutes. Victoria's lips curled into a satisfied smile. In her mind, victory was assured. No one could challenge the captain's authority, especially not a black man already portrayed as difficult. Jessica stood just behind Captain Bennett, waiting expectantly for the nod that would summon security. Alex took a deep breath. His heartbeat quickened, but externally he maintained perfect composure. "Captain," he said, each word measured and precise, "I am not being disruptive. I have broken no laws or regulations. I am asking for one simple thing. Check both boarding passes. If Ms. Reynolds truly holds the ticket for seat 1A, I will move immediately." He paused, eyes locked on Bennett's. "But if she does not, then this delay is not caused by me. It is caused by your crew's refusal to follow basic verification procedures." A heavy silence descended. Bennett frowned, clearly unaccustomed to having his judgment questioned. Yet somewhere in his expression flickered the uncomfortable recognition that Alex was right, checking boarding passes was standard procedure. Victoria quickly interjected, her voice tinged with theatrical alarm. "Captain, I honestly don't feel safe sitting next to this man. He's aggressive pressuring your crew. We can't take that risk. It was a calculated move, the I don't feel safe card designed to transform Alex from inconvenient passenger to potential threat." Bennett nodded almost reflexively, his hand moving toward the radio on his shoulder. One call and security would arrive to remove Alex from the plane. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Alex heard every thump of his heart, every fragmented whisper around him. Just give in already. What kind of man makes such a fuss over this? But instead of panic, a cold, controlled fury coursed through him. The moment had arrived. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Some passengers tensed, expecting him to start recording or call a lawyer. But Alex simply pressed a number on his speed dial, his voice clear and authoritative as he spoke. "Hello, activate Protocol 7 Flight 11847 immediately." First class fell into utter silence. No one understood what Protocol 7 meant, but the commanding way Alex had said it sent a visible chill through the crew. Bennett faltered, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He had never seen a passenger challenge him with such composed certainty. And in that moment, a secret began to leak into the cabin atmosphere. Alex Blackwood was not just another passenger. He was someone whose single phone call could shake the entire airline. The static crackle of Captain Bennett's radio broke the silence. His eyes never left Alex as he murmured into it, his voice low but urgent. The request was clear. Security was being summoned. Alex remained standing, phone still in hand. Victoria's smirk had returned, bolstered by the captain's call for backup. In her mind, victory was only minutes away. But Alex's demeanor had subtly shifted. Gone was any trace of defensive frustration. He now stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had just executed a carefully planned move in a long-anticipated chess match. "Captain Bennett," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed cabin before security arrives. "I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening here." He gestured to his boarding pass. "I have a valid ticket for seat 1A. Your crew has refused to verify the seating assignments, instead pressuring me to accept a downgrade. When I insisted on basic verification, Ms. Reynolds claimed to feel unsafe despite my calm demeanor and reasonable requests." His precise breakdown of events caused several passengers to shift uncomfortably, the absurdity of the situation becoming clearer when plainly stated. "And now," Alex continued, "rather than performing the simplest check of our boarding passes, you're calling security to remove me from a seat I legally purchased." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Sir, this is not about the seat anymore. This is about your refusal to cooperate with crew instructions." "I've cooperated fully," Alex countered. "I've remained calm, spoken respectfully, and requested only what any passenger is entitled to my assigned seat. What I have not done is surrender my rights because your crew finds it more convenient." Victoria interjected, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. We all know why you're really doing this." "And what reason would that be, Ms. Reynolds?" Alex asked, his gaze steady. Victoria fell silent, aware of the dozens of eyes now on her. A younger woman in row 3 had begun recording the exchange on her phone. An older businessman in 2D removed his reading glasses, watching the confrontation with growing interest. Alex's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, noting a message from Gabriela Montez, COO of Blackwood Global Protocol 7, initiated. "Systems monitoring Flight 1947. Documentation active." Alex slipped the phone back into his pocket, the slight smile on his lips unnerving the increasingly uncertain crew. He had given them every opportunity to handle this correctly. Now the consequences would unfold exactly as designed. 2 uniformed airport police officers stepped aboard. Officer James Wilson, 45, moved with the heavy-footed confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades handling airport disturbances. His hand rested instinctively near his radio, his expression already set in anticipation of trouble. Beside him walked Officer Diego Rodriguez, 32, whose approach was notably different. Measured steps, alert, eyes scanning the situation without predetermined judgment. His posture professional but not aggressive. First class fell into uneasy silence. Some passengers leaned forward, eager to see the confrontation they'd been anticipating. Others looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the escalation they had tacitly encouraged. Wilson stepped forward, his voice deep and authoritative. "Sir, the crew has asked you repeatedly to cooperate. If you don't comply immediately, we will have to escort you off this plane." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. "Finally, they're handling it. This has taken far too long already." But Alex stood tall, calm, his eyes steady. He looked directly at Wilson. "I'm ready to cooperate," he replied evenly. "But before you make any decisions, may I ask you one question?" Wilson hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Has anyone here checked both of our boarding passes?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silence spread through the cabin. Michael Hernandez glanced at Jessica Palmer. Both remained mute, their faces betraying a flicker of unease. Rodriguez furrowed his brow, stepping closer. "That's a fair question," he said, his voice steady yet authoritative. "I'd like to know, too. Has anyone actually verified both passengers' boarding passes?" The silence deepened. Victoria gave a dismissive laugh, lifting her chin. "Officer Ives sat in this seat many times," she said with practiced confidence. "The crew knows me. There's no need to check. Rodriguez did not move, his eyes locked on Victoria's hands still clutching her designer purse. I'm sorry, Mom, he stated firmly. The most basic procedure in a seat dispute is to verify boarding passes. I need to see yours. For a moment, Victoria hesitated. Then slowly she opened her bag, every movement strangely sluggish. Her fingers trembled slightly as she searched inside, taking longer than necessary. Her eyes flickered with unmistakable anxiety. Alex caught that moment and knew the truth was about to be exposed. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, whispers fading into confused silence. Finally, Victoria pulled out a boarding pass, handing it to Rodriguez with a strained smile. He took it, glanced once, then read aloud, his voice striking like a hammer. Seat 14F economy class. The cabin erupted. Gasps filled the air. Several mouths hung open in shock. A man near the back of first class blurted out, "Oh my God!" Victoria's face drained of color. The smug smile vanished, replaced by shock, then fury. She opened her mouth to speak, but Rodriguez's stern gaze silenced her. Captain Bennett froze, suddenly aware that he had nearly ejected a legitimate passenger to appease a blatant lie. Michael Hernandez dropped his gaze to the floor. Jessica Palmer turned away quickly, desperate to avoid the judgment now radiating from every corner of the cabin. Alex relaxed his shoulders, his eyes sweeping across the faces around him. He didn't need to say a word. The truth had spoken for itself. But inside, he knew the storm had only begun. This was never just about a seat. It was living proof of a pattern tilted toward blind trust in a blonde woman and blind suspicion of a black man fighting to claim what was rightfully his. Alex tilted his head slightly, a thin smile crossing his lips. He knew that now, not just Victoria, not just the crew, but the entire airline would face consequences for this moment that seemed so small yet carried the weight of decades. First class remained frozen in stunned silence. The boarding pass marked 14F sat limp in Officer Rodriguez's hand, undeniable evidence of Victoria Reynolds' deception. Every gaze locked onto Victoria, whose former pride had crumbled into panic. She clutched her silk scarf in her lap, lips trembling as she searched for words, but none would come. Captain Richard Bennett felt cold sweat trail down his neck. In his 30 years of aviation, he had faced engine malfunctions, medical emergencies, and violent storms. Yet never had he felt so completely in the wrong as in this moment. He had nearly forced a rightful passenger off his plane, driven solely by his own unconscious bias. "This," Victoria finally stammered, her voice barely audible. "This is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Rodriguez echoed, his tone measured but firm. "Mom, you're sitting in a seat that isn't yours, claiming it's yours, and nearly had another passenger removed." "That's not a misunderstanding." Officer Wilson, who had been ready to remove Alex moments earlier, now stood awkwardly. His certainty evaporated. His gaze shifted between Victoria and Alex, reassessing everything he had assumed upon arrival. A passenger in row 3, a young woman with glasses who had been recording the incident, spoke up. She knew exactly what she was doing. We all heard her. She never once said she might be in the wrong seat. Murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin. The tide had turned completely. Michael Hernandez stepped forward, his voice strained with forced professionalism. "Ms. Reynolds, I'll need to ask you to gather your belongings and move to your assigned seat in economy." Victoria's eyes flashed with indignation. "This is ridiculous. I'm a Gold Elite member. You can't possibly expect me to sit in economy." "Your status doesn't give you the right to take someone else's assigned seat," Rodriguez stated flatly. "Please move to 14F or you'll be escorted off the plane." Victoria looked desperately at Captain Bennett, seeking alliance, but the captain wouldn't meet her eyes. She turned to Jessica, who quickly looked away. For a fleeting moment, a different emotion crossed Victoria's face, something like recognition. For a second, she seemed to see herself clearly, a woman who had fought so hard for respect that she'd become the very thing she once despised, someone who used power to diminish others. But the moment passed, replaced by defensive anger. An older man in 2C cleared his throat. "I think we all owe this gentleman an apology," he said, gesturing toward Alex. "Especially the crew." Captain Bennett finally spoke, his voice lacking its earlier authority. "Mr. Blackwood, on behalf of Skylink Airlines, I offer my sincere apologies for this situation. Your seat is of course available to you immediately. But the damage was done." The apology felt hollow, forced by circumstance rather than genuine remorse. Everyone in that cabin knew that without Officer Rodriguez's intervention, Alex would have been removed from the flight despite being completely in the right. As Victoria struggled with her oversized Hermes bag, a small item fell from it, a first-class napkin with the Skylink logo. Several passengers noticed, and the implication was clear: she had been in first class before, possibly taking seats that weren't hers then as well. The young woman who had been recording spoke again, this time directly to Victoria. "The real question is, how many times have you done this before? How many people have been inconvenienced or removed because you decided their seat was yours?" Victoria didn't answer, but her face flushed deeper. Alex finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying easily through the cabin. "This isn't about one seat or one flight," he said. "This is about a pattern of behavior, both hers and the airline's, that needs to be addressed." He turned to Captain Bennett. "I'd like to know what procedures are in place to prevent this from happening to other passengers who might not be able to stand their ground as I did today." Bennett had no answer. The question hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. Officer Rodriguez nodded to Alex with subtle respect. "Sir, your seat is available now. We'll ensure there are no further issues." As Victoria finally exited first class, escorted by Officer Wilson, to economy passengers began to whisper among themselves. Some looked ashamed of their earlier judgments. Others seemed angry at being manipulated by Victoria's performance. Alex finally took his rightful seat by the window, the one he had paid for weeks ago. But as he settled in, he knew this incident was far from over. This was just the beginning. Alex had just fastened his seatbelt when his phone vibrated again. The cabin was still buzzing with conversation about the incident, passengers rehashing what they'd witnessed, many now casting apologetic glances in his direction. The name on his screen: Thomas Franklin, CEO of Skylink Airlines. Alex answered, not bothering to lower his voice or step away for privacy. This conversation was meant to be heard. "Hello, Tom," he said, his tone casual but clear. A ripple of surprise spread through nearby rows. Passengers leaned forward slightly. Jessica Palmer, who had returned to the galley, went visibly pale. Michael Hernandez, still standing nearby, stiffened, his eyes widening in alarm. From the phone came a commanding voice audible to those in nearby seats. "Alex, I just received an emergency alert. The system shows Flight 1 Team 47 delayed by more than 30 minutes. Your name is flagged as involved." "What's going on?" Alex's gaze swept the cabin slowly, taking in the now attentive faces around him. His reply was measured, each word deliberately chosen. "Tom, for the past 30 minutes, your crew has tried to remove me from the seat I purchased. They chose to believe a blatant lie instead of taking the simplest step of checking boarding passes. When I refused to give up my seat, they threatened to call security to drag me off." The words echoed through the suddenly silent cabin, a heavy indictment falling on the entire crew. Michael Hernandez looked physically ill. Jessica Palmer gripped a nearby seat for support. A deadly silence followed. Then Thomas Franklin's voice cut through, sharp and incredulous. "Excuse me, did I hear you correctly? Did they try to eject Alexander Blackwood, chairman of Blackwood Global Investments and majority shareholder of Skylink, from his rightful seat?" The cabin seemed to collectively gasp. Passengers' mouths fell open in disbelief. They turned to stare at Alex, eyes wide with shock. The man they had dismissed, judged, and insulted simply for his modest appearance was revealed as the one who held the power to decide the very future of this airline. Victoria, who had paused at the edge of first class upon hearing the conversation, went ashen. Jessica audibly gasped. Michael stumbled back against the bulkhead as if physically struck. Captain Bennett, who had returned to observe the situation, looked as though the floor had given way beneath him. Alex tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping coolly through the cabin. He did not raise his voice yet. His tone rang with unmistakable authority. "I am not asking for privilege, Tom. I am not demanding favor. I am demanding fairness. But today your crew chose another path, bias, prejudice, and humiliation. And now everyone here will witness the consequences." The cabin held perfectly still. Not a soul dared to move. Only the rush of air through the ventilation system and the pounding of hearts filled the silence. Thomas Franklin's voice returned now, grave with understanding. "Alex, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable situation. I assure you, apologies aren't enough anymore." "Tom," Alex interrupted. "We've had this conversation before. After the Jenkins incident last year, after the Rodriguez family in Miami, after the Thompson complaint in Chicago, each time there were apologies, promises, sensitivity training sessions. And yet here we are again." Captain Bennett's face registered shock. He clearly recognized the incidents Alex mentioned, yet had no idea the chairman had been personally tracking them. "What do you want me to do?" Franklin asked, his voice now heavy with resignation. Alex's response was immediate. "I'm invoking Protocol 7 effective immediately. Full documentation, immediate suspension of involved personnel, and complete transparency. This ends today, Tom, not with private apologies, but with public accountability." "Understood?" Franklin replied after a moment's pause. "He'll inform the board immediately. Alex, stay in contact. From this moment, all decisions regarding this situation are yours." The call ended. Alex slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket and raised his gaze, eyes flashing with quiet intensity as he surveyed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried effortlessly, "this flight is no longer ordinary. It is living evidence of a pattern of prejudice and bias, and I will not allow it to be buried like thousands of incidents before it." In that instant, everyone knew the curtain had fallen. Alex's true power was revealed, and from this moment forward, nothing could stop the consequences he was about to unleash upon the entire system. What exactly is Protocol 7? The question came from a middle-aged man in 2B who had been watching the situation unfold with increasing interest. Alex turned slightly in his seat, his manner now that of a CEO addressing stakeholders. "Protocol 7 is a comprehensive accountability framework I developed after witnessing repeated incidents of discrimination," he explained, his voice carrying easily through the hushed cabin. "It consists of 7 specific stages to ensure that instances of bias don't simply disappear into customer service reports and meaningless apologies." Captain Bennett, still standing near the galley, shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Blackwood, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Captain Alex interrupted firmly. "Privacy is what allows these incidents to continue. Transparency is what ends them." Alex's phone chimed with a notification. He glanced at it briefly before continuing. "Stage 1 has already begun. Every communication on this aircraft is now being documented. The black box recordings have been flagged for preservation. Video from cabin cameras is being secured." Jessica Palmer's face went pale. "Cabin cameras? There aren't. Skylink installed them last year as part of the security upgrade," Alex replied. "The footage is normally only accessed for security incidents, but Protocol 7 classifies discrimination as a security threat to passengers." The revelation sent whispers cascading through the cabin. Passengers glanced up at the overhead compartments and reading lights, suddenly aware they were being recorded. Stage 2 involves immediate suspension of all personnel involved in the incident pending investigation. That includes you, Captain Bennett, Mr. Hernandez, and Ms. Palmer. Bennett stepped forward, indignation flashing across his face. You can't ground a captain mid-flight. You misunderstand, Alex replied calmly. You'll complete this flight, but upon landing, you'll be placed on administrative leave. Your next scheduled flights will be reassigned. Michael Hernandez gripped the back of a seat, his face ashen. This is extreme for a simple seating misunderstanding. Was it simple, Mr. Hernandez? Alex asked. You failed to perform the most basic verification procedure. You attempted to pressure me into giving up a seat I had paid for. You supported Ms. Reynolds without evidence. At what point was this simple? Michael had no response. Alex outlined the remaining stages more concisely than he might have otherwise, focusing on their impact rather than technical details. Stage 3 involves full passenger testimony. Everyone who witnessed this incident will have the opportunity to provide statements. Stage 4 activates an independent review committee consisting of civil rights attorneys, customer advocacy groups, and industry experts. Stage 5 involves corporate accountability. Skylink will issue a public statement taking full responsibility. Stage 6 requires structural changes, revised training, updated policies, and consequences for employees who exhibit biased behavior. And finally, Stage 7 establishes ongoing monitoring and transparency. Skylink will publish quarterly reports detailing discrimination complaints and their resolutions. The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even those who had been irritated by the delay now seemed captivated by the methodical way Alex was transforming a personal slight into structural change. I developed Protocol 7 after years of watching companies issue the same meaningless apologies while changing nothing. Alex explained. It was designed to be implemented across my business holdings, but I had hoped never to use it on Skylink. Alex's phone chimed again. He checked it, then looked up with a concerned expression. I've just been informed that someone on this aircraft has attempted to access the central communications server to delete today's cabin recordings, he announced. Thankfully, Protocol 7 anticipated this possibility. All data is being backed up to secure cloud servers in real time. Captain Bennett's face paled further. It wasn't clear if he was the culprit or simply shocked by the revelation, but the implication was clear. Resistance to accountability had already begun. Whoever is attempting to interfere with this process should understand something. Alex continued, his voice taking on a new edge of steel. Protocol 7 was designed to be irreversible once activated. Attempts to obstruct it only trigger additional accountability measures. The unexpected sabotage attempt changed the atmosphere in the cabin. What had seemed like a powerful but orderly process now took on the tension of an active struggle, a battle between those trying to preserve the status quo and those demanding change. Alex settled back in his seat, the one he had rightfully purchased, and gazed out the window. The Boeing 787 was still motionless on the tarmac, but inside everything had already changed. And the real battle was just beginning. Alex felt the cabin's attention still focused on him. The revelation of his identity and the activation of Protocol 7 had transformed the atmosphere from hostile to awestruck. But he knew that momentary respect based on his position wasn't the point. The problem was much deeper than one seat on one flight. He turned back to face the cabin. What happened today isn't isolated. He said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly. It's a pattern that plays out thousands of times daily across this country in hotels, restaurants, stores, and, yes, especially in airlines. Captain Bennett, still standing near the galley, shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. 3 months ago, Alex continued, Jason Jenkins, a black college professor, was removed from a Skylink flight after a white passenger complained he was suspicious. He had been quietly grading papers. Murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in recognition of the incident, which had received minor news coverage before quickly fading. 6 months ago, the Rodriguez family, a Hispanic couple with 3 children, were forced to give up seats they had purchased together because a group of business travelers decided they wanted that row. Skylink crew supported the business travelers without checking tickets. Jessica Palmer looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Alex had clearly been tracking incidents that many in the company had assumed would be forgotten. Last year, Diane Thompson, an elderly black woman, was denied assistance with her luggage by the same flight crew that eagerly helped younger white passengers. When she complained, she was labeled difficult in her customer profile. Alex paused, letting the pattern sink in. Each time Skylink issued an apology. Each time they promised training and improvements. Each time nothing fundamentally changed. A middle-aged black woman in business class had moved to stand in the aisle, listening intently. "They tried to bump me last month," she said, her voice carrying forward. "I had to show my boarding pass 3 times while the white man next to me wasn't asked once." Alex nodded in acknowledgement. "This isn't about comfort or convenience. It's about dignity. It's about the exhaustion of constantly having to prove you belong in spaces you've rightfully paid to occupy." Captain Bennett finally spoke, his tone defensive despite his attempt at contrition. "Mr. Blackwood, I assure you Skylink doesn't condone discrimination. We treat all our passengers." "Intentions aren't relevant," Captain Alex interrupted. "Results are, and the results show a clear pattern." He gestured toward where Victoria had been sitting. "Your crew was willing to believe without verification that a well-dressed white woman belonged in this seat. They were equally willing to believe, despite my ticket, that I didn't." The simple truth of this statement hung in the air, impossible to deny. A young man in row 3 who had been recording spoke up. "I've got the whole thing on video. What should I do with it?" "Share it," Alex replied without hesitation. "Transparency is the only path to accountability. Protocol 7 isn't about private settlements or confidential resolutions. It's about public change." "But won't that damage the airline's reputation?" asked an older gentleman who had earlier seemed irritated by the delay. Alex looked at him directly. The airline damaged its own reputation through its actions. "My concern isn't protecting Skylink's image. It's protecting future passengers from experiencing what I just did." This statement seemed to resonate even with those who had initially sided against Alex. The conversation shifted from defending institutional norms to questioning them. "Even some of us sitting here," said a woman in her 60s, "were quick to assume you were the problem, weren't we?" "That's something I need to think about." The candid self-reflection sparked nods from several other passengers, the beginnings of a deeper awakening. Alex's phone buzzed with a notification. He checked it and looked up with renewed intensity. "I've just received word that similar incidents are being reported across Skylink's network as we speak. Flight attendants on other routes emboldened by what's happening here are coming forward with their own documentation of discriminatory practices." This revelation stunned the cabin. What had begun as an isolated confrontation was rapidly expanding into a company-wide reckoning. "This is what change looks like," Alex said quietly. "It doesn't begin with corporate statements or diversity seminars. It begins when people refuse to accept what they've been conditioned to accept. It begins when one person says enough." As he finished speaking, the plane's engines began to spool up. Captain Bennett had received clearance for departure nearly an hour behind schedule. The flight would proceed to Los Angeles, but everyone aboard knew this journey had become about much more than physical distance. It had become about the distance between what we claim to believe and how we actually behave when power and privilege are at stake. 30,000 feet above Kansas Flight 1847 proceeded toward Los Angeles with unusual tension. But 2,000 miles away in Skylink's gleaming operations center outside Atlanta, chaos reigned. Emergency lights flashed across the central monitoring screen where Flight 1947 now displayed an ominous red border and the designation P7 active, a code no one in the room had ever seen before today. Thomas Franklin, CEO of Skylink, burst through the glass doors of the operations center, his typically immaculate appearance showing signs of haste, tie slightly askew, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Behind him followed a stream of executives, legal counsel, and public relations staff, all wearing expressions ranging from confusion to outright panic. "Someone explain to me exactly what Protocol 7 means in practical terms," Franklin demanded as he reached the central command desk. Abigail Winters, director of operations, looked up from her screen with visible distress. "It's unprecedented, sir. The entire flight has been flagged in our system as a civil rights incident. Every communication from the cockpit is being separately archived." "That's just the beginning," added Marcus Reynolds, the airline's chief technology officer, who was frantically reviewing code on his tablet. "The protocol has triggered automatic notifications to our board of directors, major shareholders." And he paused, swallowing hard, the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection. Franklin's face paled. "The DOT has already been notified. Without any internal review, that's part of the protocol, sir," Marcus confirmed. "Immediate external notification to prevent any appearance of a cover-up." "Who authorized this system?" Franklin demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Mr. Blackwood implemented it 6 months ago as part of the governance overhaul after the acquisition," Abigail explained. "It was in the documentation package section 27B, which no one apparently bothered to read carefully," Franklin muttered. Across the room, the social media monitoring screens were beginning to light up. Danielle Park, head of corporate communications, approached with her own tablet displaying a Twitter feed. "Sir, we have a situation developing online," she reported grimly. "Passengers on the flight are already posting. One video has over 20,000 views in just 15 minutes. She held up the screen showing footage clearly filmed from row 3 of Flight 11847. The video captured the moment Officer Rodriguez read Victoria's boarding pass aloud, revealing she had lied about her seat assignment. The caption read, "Watch this entitled woman try to steal a black passenger seat, then airline crew tries to remove him instead of her. Plot twist at the end. Seatgate. Skylink. Shame." Franklin watched the clip with growing horror. "Who's the passenger recording this Zoe Alvarez journalism student at UCLA? She has about 15,000 followers, but the video is being shared by accounts with much larger platforms," Danielle reported. "We've already identified 3 major news outlets preparing to run the story." "Have we issued any statement?" Franklin asked. "We can't," Marcus interjected. "Protocol 7 requires all communications to be approved by the Independent Review Committee, which hasn't even been assembled yet. So we just sit here while our reputation burns," Franklin demanded. Just then, a new face entered the operations center. Amanda Donovan, Skylink's chief operating officer and Franklin's most trusted lieutenant. Her expression was grim as she approached. "Tom, we have a bigger problem," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Someone tried to access the flight recording system to delete data from Flight 11847. Franklin stared at her in disbelief. "Who we don't know yet, but the attempt triggered additional security protocols. Every communication on that flight is now being backed up to 3 separate servers, including one controlled directly by Blackwood Global." Franklin slammed his hand on the nearest desk. "Who would be stupid enough to—" "It gets worse," Amanda interrupted. "The attempt came from a senior executive access code. Someone in this building, Tom. The implication was clear. Someone at the highest levels of Skylink was already trying to cover up the incident." The betrayal stunned Franklin into momentary silence. "Blackwood's team sent this message 5 minutes ago." Amanda continued, holding up her phone to show an email. "They've identified the access code used in the deletion attempt and are providing it to DOT investigators unless we do so ourselves within the hour." "They're forcing our hand," Franklin realized aloud. "Making us choose between transparency or complicity." "Precisely," Amanda confirmed. "And given what's happening online right now, I strongly recommend transparency." Franklin nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. Find out who did this. Now. I want a name before that hour is up. As if the situation weren't dire enough, the financial impact was beginning to materialize. On a large screen displaying Skylink's stock performance, a red line plummeted downward, the ticker showing a 5% drop in just 30 minutes. The market is responding to the social media explosion, explained the chief financial officer who had been monitoring the situation from his desk. Investors hate uncertainty, and right now we're a big question mark. Franklin turned to address the entire room. Listen carefully. Protocol 7 is now active and we will comply fully. Any attempt to obstruct this process will result in immediate termination. If anyone in this room knows anything about the deletion attempt, come forward now. This is your only opportunity for leniency. The room fell silent. No one stepped forward, but nervous glances were exchanged among several executives. Very well, Franklin continued. Amanda, work with legal to prepare our full cooperation statement for the DOT. Marcus, ensure complete data preservation across all systems. Danielle, draft a preliminary statement acknowledging the incident without attempting to spin it. We'll release it as soon as the review committee is formed. As the team dispersed to execute these directives, Franklin turned to stare at the display tracking Flight 1947's progress across America. The plane itself was functioning normally, continuing its journey westward. But inside that metal tube, and now throughout his entire company, a revolution had begun. And he had the sinking feeling that his role in Skylink's future had just changed from leader to caretaker during its transformation, or perhaps its dismantling. While Flight 1847 crossed over Colorado, the digital wildfire was spreading at internet speed. Zoe Alvarez's original video had jumped from 20,000 to 500,000 views in less than an hour. The hashtags #HasherSeat1A and #FlyingWhileBlack were trending nationally. Major news sites had picked up the story, their headlines growing increasingly dramatic. Black executive nearly removed from his own airline. After white passenger takes his seat. Skylink discrimination scandal. The seat confrontation that revealed corporate bias. Airline chairman tests his own company, and it failed spectacularly. In the first-class cabin, Zoe had switched from recording to live tweeting updates at Zoe Reports update on #Seat1A situation. Crew now treating Mr. Blackwood with extreme caution. Same attendant who tried to remove him now offering champagne every 10 minutes. The power shift is both satisfying and uncomfortable to watch. Her thread had been shared by several celebrities with millions of followers, each adding their own commentary. At film director Ive experienced this exact situation on multiple airlines. The difference I didn't own the company. Watching #Seat1A unfold is deeply satisfying. At Popstar. This Seat1A story is wild. Reminder that discrimination happens daily to those without power to fight back. This time, the airline picked the wrong passenger. However, not all reactions were supportive. A counter-narrative was emerging on certain platforms, at Business Analyst. Unpopular opinion. Blackwood is using his power to publicly shame employees who made an honest mistake. This is corporate bullying, not justice. Team Victoria, at Travel Influencer. Am I the only one who thinks Protocol 7 is massive overkill for a simple seating dispute? Blackwood could have resolved this quietly. Instead, he's destroying an airline's reputation for his ego. #Seatgate. These contrasting viewpoints sparked heated debates across social platforms with #TeamAlex and #TeamVictoria hashtags emerging as people took sides. The controversy only amplified the story's reach, pushing it into mainstream news coverage. Victoria Reynolds, now seated in 14F between a crying infant and a man with apparent disregard for personal space, had turned off her phone after receiving a flurry of texts from colleagues who had somehow already identified her from the videos. Her law firm's social media accounts were being flooded with comments about their senior partner's behavior. Meanwhile, in economy class, Elena Diaz, a Skylink flight attendant who had been assigned to the rear cabin, was surreptitiously sending messages to other crew members across the Skylink network. It's finally happening. Someone with power is standing up to the pattern we've all seen. If you have documented incidents of bias, now is the time. Protocol 7 includes whistleblower protection. Her message was being shared in private employee groups, emboldening others to come forward with their own observations of discriminatory practices they had witnessed or been instructed to perform. Elena had a personal reason for her courage today. 2 years earlier, when she was still new to Skylink, she had reported a supervisor who had explicitly instructed crew to use visual cues to identify passengers who might be in the wrong cabin. After filing her complaint, she had been reassigned to less desirable routes and passed over for promotion twice. Today felt like vindication and an opportunity to finally create change. On Wall Street, Skylink's stock had begun to drop as investors reacted to the unfolding PR crisis. Financial news tickers reported Skylink SLK down 4.2%. Amid viral discrimination incident involving company chairman. Analysts predict potential material impact on Skylink following activation of Protocol 7 accountability framework. Other airlines were quickly attempting to distance themselves from the controversy while simultaneously capitalizing on it. At Pacific Airlines. At Pacific, every passenger deserves their assigned seat regardless of race, gender, or appearance. We verify all seating disputes with simple boarding pass checks. Fly with respect. At Atlantis. Air Atlantis. Air has maintained a zero-tolerance discrimination policy since 2020. Our crew undergoes monthly equity training. Your dignity matters to us. Fly Atlantis. The Skylink communications team, hamstrung by Protocol 7's restrictions on unapproved statements, could only monitor the explosion of content without responding. Their social listening dashboard showed sentiment analysis plummeting by the minute, with words like discrimination bias and boycott dominating the conversation. A text exchange between two Skylink board members was forwarded to Thomas Franklin Board Member 1. Have you seen what's happening online? This is a 5-alarm fire. Board Member 2. Blackwood set this up perfectly. He tested his own airline and we failed in the most public way possible. Board Member 1. The question is whether he's trying to reform the airline or burn it to the ground. Board Member 2. Either way, heads will roll, starting with anyone involved in today's incident. Back on the flight, passengers had formed clear factions. Some were openly supportive of Alex, making a point to stop by his seat and express solidarity. Others sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact, perhaps recognizing their own complicity and initially siding with Victoria. Captain Bennett's voice came over the intercom, noticeably strained as he delivered the promised transparent announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to address the delay we experienced prior to departure. A passenger was seated in a seat that was not assigned to them specifically, seat 1A, which belonged to another passenger. When the rightful passenger attempted to claim his seat, our crew incorrectly sided with the wrongfully seated passenger without proper verification of boarding passes. This incident has resulted in the activation of a special protocol for bias incidents. We apologize for the delay and for the improper handling of the situation. The awkward silence that followed his announcement was broken only by the sound of dozens of passengers typing furiously on their phones, sending his words into the digital sphere where they would live forever. Flight 1947 continued westward, a flying epicenter of a controversy that was rapidly expanding far beyond one seat or one flight. 2 hours into the flight, as the social media firestorm continued to spread, Alex's phone rang again. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, with the crew providing minimal service, clearly unsure how to interact with the man they had nearly removed, who turned out to be their boss. Gabriella Alex answered his voice carrying in the hushed cabin. Update me. Gabriela Montez 38, COO of Blackwood Global and Alex's most trusted executive, spoke with the precision and confidence that had made her his right hand for the past decade. Protocol 7 is fully operational, Alex. The independent review committee is being assembled as we speak. We've secured Judge Williams, Professor Abernathy, and Ms. Tanaka from the Consumer Rights Coalition. Alex nodded, though she couldn't see him. Good. They're all respected and impartial. What about the documentation? Complete preservation of all records is underway. We've already secured the pre-boarding camera footage, which clearly shows Ms. Reynolds moving from economy to first class during the initial boarding confusion. We also have the cabin audio, which matches the passenger videos circulating online. Around Alex, passengers were listening intently, some making no effort to hide their interest in this behind-the-scenes glimpse. And the deletion attempt? Alex asked, his voice hardening slightly. Gabriella's tone became grave. We've traced it. The access code belongs to James Whitman, Skylink's Executive Vice President of Operations. This revelation sent a ripple of whispers through the cabin. Passengers exchanged shocked glances. Whitman Alex repeated, clearly surprised. He was one of the strongest advocates for the acquisition. Why would he? There's more, Gabriella interrupted. We've uncovered emails between Whitman and the crew scheduling department showing a pattern of assigning certain flight attendants, those with documented bias complaints, to premium routes with high-profile passengers. The selection wasn't random, Alex. It was deliberate. Alex's expression darkened. The implication was clear. The discrimination wasn't just individual behavior, it was being actively enabled and protected at the highest levels of the organization. Send everything to the DOT investigators, Alex instructed. And copy the board. They need to understand the depth of what we're dealing with. Already done, Gabriella confirmed. Franklin has been informed as well. He's demanding Whitman's resignation within the hour. What about Victoria Reynolds? Alex asked. Her law firm Blackwell and Turner has already issued a statement distancing themselves from her actions, Gabriella reported. Several of their major clients are threatening to pull their business. Alex shook his head slightly. Accountability extends beyond Skylink. She's part of this too. Agreed, Gabriella said. On that note, Zoe Alvarez has reached out to our press office. She wants to do a more in-depth piece on Protocol 7 and how it was developed. I think it could be valuable. Humanize the story, explain why this matters beyond one incident. Alex considered this. Approve it. She's shown integrity in her reporting so far, but make sure she understands this isn't about me personally. It's about creating sustainable change. Of course, Gabriella confirmed. One more thing, Elena Diaz, a flight attendant in economy on your flight, has come forward as a whistleblower. She has documentation of at least a dozen similar incidents over the past year, including emails from supervisors instructing crew to use discretion with certain passengers, which she believes was code for racial profiling. This information caused a visible reaction among the crew members within earshot. Jessica Palmer quickly retreated to the galley, while Michael Hernandez stared straight ahead, his face ashen. Make sure she has full whistleblower protection, Alex instructed, and expedite her testimony to the review committee. Already done, Gabriella assured him. One last question, Alex. The board is requesting a private meeting with you upon landing. How do you want to handle it? Alex's voice took on a new firmness. Tell them he'll meet with them, but not privately. Protocol 7 means transparency. Any meeting will include representatives from the Independent Review Committee. No closed doors, no off-the-record conversations. They won't like that, Gabriella noted. They don't have to like it, Alex replied. But they will respect it because they have no choice. As he ended the call, Alex noticed several passengers nodding in approval. The young man in 3D gave him a subtle thumbs up. Even the older businessman in 2B, who had initially seemed irritated by the delay, was looking at Alex with newfound respect. But not everyone appeared convinced. A woman in her 50s leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made them both frown disapprovingly at Alex. The divisions in the cabin mirrored those forming online, some seeing necessary accountability, others seeing excessive punishment for what they still considered a minor incident. Alex was unconcerned by these divided reactions. Real change was never universally popular, especially among those who benefited from the status quo. What mattered was that the machinery of accountability was now in motion, and nothing. Not executive sabotage, not public opinion, not even the Skylink board could stop it. Captain Bennett's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival." Alex gazed out the window at the mountains below, aware that the landscape of commercial aviation was already changing, all because he had refused to give up a seat that was rightfully his. When Officer Rodriguez had escorted Victoria Reynolds to her actual seat in economy class, her humiliation had been complete. Gone was the first-class luxury she had tried to claim. Instead, she found herself wedged into 14F, a middle seat, in the last third of the aircraft. On her left sat a young mother with a fussy infant. On her right, a heavy-set man had already claimed both armrests and seemed to consider the boundary between seats a mere suggestion. The space Victoria had to herself was barely enough to contain her designer outfit, let alone her wounded pride. "This is absurd," she had protested when Rodriguez guided her firmly down the aisle. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes, Mom," Rodriguez had replied calmly. "You're the passenger assigned to seat 14F. His matter-of-fact response had drawn smiles from nearby passengers, many of whom had already heard about the incident through the aircraft's efficient gossip network. Now, 2 hours into the flight, Victoria sat rigid with fury. She had switched off her phone after it began buzzing incessantly with notifications, colleagues, clients, even friends who had somehow already seen the videos circulating online. The last message she'd read from her assistant was particularly disturbing. "The managing partners are calling an emergency meeting. Videos of the incident are trending. Please call immediately." A flight attendant approached with the beverage cart. "Water, soda." "Coffee?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral but noticeably cooler than when addressing other passengers. "Vodka tonic?" Victoria snapped. "Double." "I'm sorry, Mom, but alcoholic beverages are only complimentary in first class," the attendant replied. "In economy, they're available for purchase." Victoria's face flushed deeper. "Fine. Water." As the attendant handed her a small plastic cup of ice water so different from the crystal glassware of first class, the passenger behind Victoria leaned forward. "Aren't you the lady who tried to steal that man's seat in first class?" she asked, loudly enough for several rows to hear. "I saw it on my daughter's Instagram. She follows that journalism student who was recording everything." Victoria stared straight ahead, pretending not to hear, but the damage was done. Heads turned. Whispers spread. Several passengers pulled out phones either to verify her identity or to capture new footage of the now infamous seat thief. In this moment of public shame, Victoria's thoughts drifted to her childhood in rural Pennsylvania, where her single mother had worked double shifts as a waitress to make ends meet. She remembered the sting of being the scholarship kid at an elite college, watching classmates casually spend more on a weekend than her mother made in a month. She had fought tooth and nail to reach her position at Blackwell and Turner, enduring casual sexism, working twice as hard as her male peers, sacrificing personal relationships for career advancement. She had believed that success meant never having to feel small again, never having to justify her presence in exclusive spaces. And now, here she was, back in economy, being stared at and whispered about like the outsider she had spent a lifetime trying not to be. For a brief moment, Victoria saw a parallel between her own struggles and what Alexander Blackwood might have experienced, the constant need to prove you belonged, the exhaustion of fighting for spaces others took for granted. But the insight was fleeting, quickly overwhelmed by indignation and self-preservation. Her phone, which she had briefly turned back on to check messages, dinged with an email from the managing partner of her firm, Victoria. The executive committee has reviewed videos of an incident on Skylink Flight 1947 involving you attempting to claim another passenger's seat through deception. This behavior violates our firm's ethics policy and has already resulted in 2 clients contacting us to terminate their representation. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a formal review. Do not contact clients or access firm resources until this matter is resolved. We will meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss your future with Blackwell and Turner. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief. Administrative leave over an airplane seat. But as the reality of her situation sank in, she realized it wasn't just about the seat. It was about being caught on video attempting to use her privilege to displace someone else, then trying to have them removed when they stood their ground. It was about the smug certainty that the system would side with her, and the humiliating public revelation that she was wrong. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Reynolds faced a consequence she couldn't litigate, negotiate, or intimidate her way out of. 4 rows ahead, a passenger was watching Zoe Alvarez's latest video update the volume just loud enough for Victoria to hear her own name mentioned alongside terms like entitlement privilege and accountability. Victoria closed her eyes, the weight of public judgment crushing down on her as Flight 1847 continued its journey to Los Angeles, carrying her not toward her intended business meeting but toward a reckoning she never saw coming. With the aircraft beginning its initial descent into Los Angeles, Captain Richard Bennett faced a decision that would define the remainder of his 30-year career. Protocol 7 had thrown the standard operating procedures into disarray, and as captain, he was caught between company policy aviation regulations and the unmistakable authority of Alexander Blackwood. In the cockpit, First Officer James Wilson watched with concern as Bennett stared at the dispatch communications, his hands uncharacteristically tense on the controls. Captain Wilson prompted gently. "LAX is requesting our final approach confirmation." Bennett nodded, making the necessary radio response before turning to his co-pilot. "James, in all my years of flying, I've never experienced anything like this." "The seat dispute," Wilson asked. "The consequences," Bennett clarified. "Protocol 7 has already flagged my personnel file. I've received notification that he'll be on administrative leave as soon as we land." Wilson's eyes widened. "For a seating issue? That seems extreme." Bennett shook his head slowly. "It wasn't just a seating issue. I nearly had a passenger removed from this aircraft without verifying his ticket. I took sides based on—" He trailed off, the uncomfortable truth hanging in the air. Based on appearances, Wilson finished for him. "Yes," Bennett admitted. "And the worst part is I didn't even realize I was doing it. It felt like standard procedure at the time." The cockpit fell silent as both men contemplated the implications. Finally, Bennett made a decision. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood before we land," he said, unbuckling his harness. "Take the controls. He'll be back in 5 minutes." "Is that wise?" Captain Wilson asked. "Leaving the cockpit right now. It's necessary," Bennett replied firmly. "For the record log, this is an operational discussion with a majority shareholder." In the first-class cabin, Alex looked up from his laptop as Captain Bennett approached. The other passengers watched with undisguised interest, sensing another chapter in the unfolding drama. Mr. Blackwood Bennett began, his voice lower than normal. "May I have a word?" Alex gestured to the empty seat across the aisle. "Of course, Captain." Bennett sat down, his posture stiff with discomfort. "Sir, I've been notified about the administrative leave. I understand the protocol, and I'm not here to dispute it." Alex waited, saying nothing. "I wanted to ask—" Bennett hesitated, then continued with visible effort. What happens to this flight and its data under Protocol 7? Does it become a case study for what not to do? That depends. Alex replied evenly on what happens next. I don't understand. Protocol 7 isn't just about punishment, Captain Alex explained. It's about creating meaningful change. How people respond after their mistakes are exposed matters just as much as the initial error. Bennett considered this. I've been flying for 30 years, sir. I've prided myself on treating all passengers with respect. Today has forced me to question that belief. For the first time, genuine regret showed in the captain's expression. I failed today, not just as a Skylink employee, but as someone responsible for the dignity and safety of every person on this aircraft. Alex studied him carefully. That's a start. What would you do differently given the chance? Verify first. Listen equally. Question my assumptions, Bennett replied without hesitation, and create a cockpit culture where first officers feel empowered to challenge a captain's bias. Alex nodded slowly. Put that in your statement to the review committee. They'll want to hear specific commitments, not just general remorse. Bennett straightened slightly. You think there's a path forward then? For someone who made the mistake I did? Protocol 7 isn't designed to end careers, Captain Alex said. It's designed to transform them. The question is whether you're willing to become part of the solution. For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Bennett's face. Yes, I believe I am. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Jessica Palmer approached tentatively. She had been watching the exchange from the galley, gathering her courage. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice unsteady. I want to apologize for my role in what happened. There's no excuse for how I treated you. Alex looked up at her. You're right, Miss Palmer. There isn't. She flinched slightly at his directness, but he continued. Recognition is the first step. The review committee will want to know why you acted as you did and what specific changes you'll make going forward. I understand, she said quietly. He'll be completely honest with them. As Jessica returned to her duties, a tense exchange was taking place in the back of the aircraft. Elena Diaz, the whistleblower flight attendant, had been confronted by Michael Hernandez in the rear galley. You're making a huge mistake, Elena, he hissed, keeping his voice low but intense. Do you really think Blackwood cares about people like us? We're just pawns to him. Elena stood her ground. I've documented 12 incidents in the past year alone. Michael, I reported each one through proper channels. What happened? Nothing. Today, something's finally happening. You'll be blacklisted, Michael warned. No airline will touch you after this. Protocol 7 includes whistleblower protection, Elena replied calmly. Besides, I'd rather leave this industry than continue enabling discrimination. Michael's face hardened. You're going to regret this. No, Elena said with quiet certainty. For the first time in 2 years, I don't regret a thing. Their confrontation was interrupted by the approach chime. The plane had begun its final descent into Los Angeles, where cameras, reporters, and executives already waited at the gate, along with the consequences that would reshape not just individual careers, but an entire industry. The wheels of Flight 1847 touched down at LAX at 11:42 a.m. local time. As the Boeing 787 taxied toward the gate, passengers peered through the windows at an unusual sight. News vans with satellite dishes raised their logos, visible even from the runway. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Bennett's voice came over the intercom, noticeably more subdued than his usual confident tone. Welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. Local time is 11:42 a.m. with clear skies and 78 degrees. Before we deplane, I have been instructed to inform you that representatives from Skylink's corporate office will be greeting this flight. There is also media presence at the terminal. If you witnessed today's incident regarding Seat 1A and wish to provide a statement, Skylink representatives will be available at Gate 54B. The unusual announcement confirmed what many had suspected: this flight had become something historic. Alex remained seated as the seatbelt sign turned off, allowing other passengers to gather their belongings first. Several stopped to speak with him briefly, offering words of support or simply nodding in acknowledgement. Zoe Alvarez approached, recorder in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, what are your thoughts as we land? This story has already gone viral. This isn't about virality, Ms. Alvarez." Alex replied calmly. "It's about changing a pattern that affects thousands of passengers every day. The attention is just a tool to ensure accountability can't be avoided." His response was measured, lacking the vindictiveness many might have expected from someone who had been wronged so publicly. Instead, he spoke with the clarity of purpose that had built his business empire, focused not on punishment, but on lasting reform. As the aircraft door opened, the distinction between a normal flight and Flight 1847 became immediately apparent. Standing in the jet bridge was a phalanx of suits Skylink executives, with expressions ranging from contrition to barely concealed panic. At the front stood Evelyn Richardson, chairwoman of Skylink's board of directors, her usual commanding presence diminished by the circumstances. Beside her, Thomas Franklin, the CEO, clutched a folder with white-knuckled intensity. Alex rose, straightened his simple blazer, and moved toward the exit with unhurried confidence. Mr. Blackwood Richardson began as soon as he appeared in the doorway on behalf of the entire board. Alex raised a hand, gently interrupting. "Not here, Evelyn. The Independent Review Committee is waiting in the Admiral's Lounge." "Well, speak there." She blinked clearly, unaccustomed to being redirected. "Of course, but I want to assure you all statements will be made with the committee present," Alex said firmly. "Protocol 7 requires transparency, not private assurances." As Alex moved past the executives into the terminal, the waiting media erupted with shouted questions and flashing cameras. He continued walking, neither hurrying nor avoiding the attention, his expression calm but determined. Victoria Reynolds emerged from the aircraft several minutes later, attempting to shield her face with her hand as reporters recognized her from the now viral videos. "Ms. Reynolds, did you intentionally try to take Mr. Blackwood's seat? Were you aware of who he was? Does your law firm know about this incident?" She pushed past without answering, her carefully constructed professional persona crumbling under the spotlight of public scrutiny. Captain Bennett, First Officer Wilson, and the cabin crew were directed to a separate room where Skylink HR representatives waited to process their administrative leave. Their faces showed the gravity of the situation, careers built over decades now hanging in uncertain balance. In the Admiral's Lounge, transformed into an impromptu headquarters, Alex was greeted by the just-assembled Independent Review Committee Judge Marianne Williams, a retired federal judge known for her work on civil rights cases, Professor James Abernathy, an expert on corporate ethics from Columbia University, and Naomi Tanaka, Executive Director of the Consumer Rights Coalition. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Williams said as he entered, the committee has received initial documentation and passenger statements. We've also reviewed the videos circulating online. Alex nodded. Thank you all for responding so quickly. Protocol 7 requires independent oversight to be established within 3 hours of an incident. As they began their preliminary assessment, an unexpected development was unfolding in the terminal. James Whitman, the executive who had attempted to delete flight recordings, was being escorted from the building by security, his access badge and company devices confiscated. "You can't do this," he protested to the security team. "I've been with this airline for 20 years. Your termination is effective immediately," replied the head of security, a woman who had previously reported to Whitman. "The evidence of your attempted interference is irrefutable." As Whitman was led away, passing travelers recorded the scene on their phones, adding another chapter to the unfolding drama. The swift and public consequence sent a clear message throughout Skylink. Protocol 7 meant business, and no one, regardless of rank or tenure, was immune from accountability. Meanwhile, Elena Diaz was met by representatives from the Whistleblower Protection Program who escorted her to a secure location where she could provide her testimony without fear of retaliation. The documentation she had meticulously collected over 2 years was about to become central to the broader investigation of Skylink's practices. Outside in the terminal, passengers from Flight 1847 were already sharing their experiences with news outlets, social media, and Skylink representatives. What had begun as a dispute over a single seat was expanding into a national conversation about dignity, fairness, and the cost of discrimination, all because one man had refused to surrender what was rightfully his. While the Independent Review Committee began its formal assessment in the Admiral's Lounge, Skylink's executive team had commandeered Conference Room D in the airline's LAX Operations Center. The expansive room typically used for weather emergency planning had been transformed into a crisis management headquarters. Thomas Franklin paced at the front of the room, his earlier composure now completely abandoned. Behind him, a large screen displayed real-time social media analytics, stock price movement, and news coverage. All of it negative and growing worse by the minute. "Our stock is down 7.3%. And still falling," reported Danielle Park, head of corporate communications. The hashtag #BoycottSkylink has been used over 200,000 times in the past hour alone. The DOT has officially opened an investigation, added Jeffrey Morgan, Skylink's general counsel, looking up from his tablet. They're citing potential pattern of discriminatory practices and have requested preservation of all records from the past 5 years related to passenger removal incidents. Franklin stopped pacing, bracing himself against the conference table. How the hell did we miss this Protocol 7 thing in the acquisition documents? Someone tell me that. Morgan shifted uncomfortably. It was buried in subsection 27B of the governance addendum. Technically, we signed off on it, but nobody bothered to read the fine print when we were acquiring a controlling interest in our own company. Franklin finished bitterly. The door opened as Evelyn Richardson entered, her face grim after her initial meeting with the review committee. "It's worse than we thought," she announced without preamble. "Blackwood has been building this protocol for years. It's not just a reaction to today, it's a carefully designed reform mechanism that he's been waiting to deploy." "Can we challenge it legally?" Franklin asked desperately. Morgan shook his head. "No. We explicitly agreed to it in the acquisition. Any attempt to block it now would trigger additional penalties, including potential loss of routes and regulatory scrutiny." "What about the board?" Franklin looked to Richardson. "Surely they can intervene?" "The board is in chaos," Richardson replied, sinking into a chair. 3 members have already called for your resignation, Tom. They're saying the leadership failed to properly vet the governance terms of the Blackwood investment. Just as the situation seemed at its bleakest, the door burst open again. Amanda Donovan, Skylink's chief operating officer, rushed in, her expression oddly triumphant despite the circumstances. "I've got something," she announced, plugging a flash drive into the main display. "We found Whitman's private email server. He wasn't acting alone." The screen filled with email exchanges, dozens of messages between Whitman and several board members dating back months before the Blackwood acquisition. They knew, Amanda explained, scrolling through the damning evidence. They knew about the discrimination complaints. They knew about the pattern. They've been actively burying reports, reassigning whistleblowers, even maintaining an unofficial problem passenger list of people who complained about bias, most of them minorities. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one incident on one flight. It wasn't even about a few bad actors. It was about a corporate culture that had systematically enabled discrimination while working to conceal it. "How many board members are implicated?" Richardson asked, her voice barely audible. 4, Amanda replied, "including Harrison Davies." Richardson paled. Davies was the board's longest-serving member and her personal mentor. "Does Blackwood know about this yet?" Franklin asked. "Not yet," Amanda confirmed. "I came straight here. We have maybe 30 minutes before his team discovers it. The room erupted in urgent debate. Some executives argued for immediate disclosure, hoping transparency might mitigate the damage. Others insisted on legal review before releasing such explosive information. In the midst of this chaos, Richardson made a decisive move. She stood silencing the room with a raised hand. "Amanda, take this directly to the review committee," she ordered. "Not to Blackwood, not to legal, not to PR, to the committee." Evelyn protested the general counsel. "We need to control how this information—" "That thinking is what got us here," Richardson interrupted sharply. "The culture of control, concealment, and self-protection. It ends today." She turned to address the entire room. "Make no mistake, Skylink as we know it is over. The question is whether we help build what comes next or get swept away with the old regime." As Amanda left with the evidence, the remaining executives sat in stunned silence. The screen behind them updated with a new stock price down 9.1%. "What do we do now?" someone finally asked. Franklin, who had remained silent during Richardson's declaration, looked up with newfound resolve. "We cooperate. Completely. We open every file share, every email, expose every corner of this airline to scrutiny." "That could destroy us," protested a senior VP. Maybe Franklin acknowledged, but covering up nearly did. "I'd rather Skylink be remembered as the company that faced its failures and changed than the one that fought to preserve a broken system until the bitter end." As if to punctuate his point, a notification appeared on the main screen, a press release from Blackwell and Turner law firm announcing Victoria Reynolds' termination effective immediately. The message was clear: accountability had arrived, and no one would be spared its reckoning. Victoria Reynolds sat alone in the back of a rideshare vehicle, her phone continuously buzzing with notifications she was now too afraid to check. The driver had recognized her from social media. His subtle double-take in the rearview mirror confirmed it, but mercifully he had said nothing. LAX had been a gauntlet of cameras and shouted questions. She had pushed through with her head down, offering no comments, her usual commanding presence replaced by the hunched posture of someone trying to disappear. Now headed to her hotel instead of the client meeting she had flown to Los Angeles for, Victoria finally gathered the courage to assess the damage. She opened her email first. 27 new messages from partners at Blackwell and Turner. The subject lines told the story: emergency partner meeting, re-LAX incident, client complaints regarding V. Reynolds' board statement on partner conduct. With trembling fingers, she opened the most recent from managing partner William Blackwell himself. "Victoria, the executive committee has reviewed multiple videos of your conduct on Skylink 1847. We are frankly appalled. Your actions directly contradict our firm's ethical standards and have already resulted in 3 major clients threatening to terminate their relationships with us. Your employment with Blackwell and Turner is terminated effective immediately. Security has been instructed to deny you access to our offices. Your firm email and system access will be disabled within the hour. A courier will deliver your personal belongings to your home address. Any attempt to contact clients will be considered a hostile action and addressed accordingly." William Blackwell, managing partner. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief. After 15 years as a senior partner, after bringing in millions in billable hours, they were cutting her off without even allowing her to defend herself. She switched to news sites, immediately regretting the decision. Her face was everywhere, screen captured from the viral videos in her most unflattering moments. Elite attorney, caught stealing, airline seat, then playing victim. Law firm distances itself from partner. After airline discrimination incident, Victoria Reynolds, the face of entitled privilege on Skylink 1847. The Bloomberg article was particularly devastating. Sources within Blackwell and Turner indicate that Reynolds' behavior on Flight 1847 wasn't shocking to colleagues who described a pattern of imperious conduct and ethical corner-cutting throughout her career. The only surprise, said one anonymous partner, is that she finally faced consequences. Her phone rang her assistant, Ryan. "Victoria, he began awkwardly. "I've been instructed to cancel all your client meetings and notify you that your office is being packed up by HR." "They're packing my office." Victoria's voice rose in panic. "They can't do that. I have confidential client materials. A supervising partner is overseeing it." Ryan explained, his tone making it clear he was reading from a script. "Your personal items will be shipped to your home. Your cases are being reassigned." Reassigned. Victoria felt physically ill. "Ryan, they can't possibly." "I'm sorry, Victoria." He interrupted, his voice suddenly firm. "I've been instructed not to discuss firm business with you further. They're assigning me to Jennifer's team effective immediately." The line went dead. Her loyal assistant of 7 years had just cut her off. Victoria's social media was next, and possibly worst of all. Her carefully curated LinkedIn profile with its 5,000-plus prestigious connections was flooded with comments. "Is this the same Victoria Reynolds from the Skylink incident? Embarrassing to see this behavior from a supposed professional. I've removed Ms. Reynolds from my network. Character matters in our profession. As someone who's faced discrimination when flying while black, I find Ms. Reynolds' conduct reprehensible." Even her personal Instagram, where she had meticulously documented her luxury lifestyle, first-class travel, 5-star hotels, exclusive restaurants, had become a battleground. Each post now attracted hundreds of negative comments, many tagging her law firm and major clients. The rideshare driver cleared his throat. "We've arrived, Mom." Victoria looked up, startled to see they had reached her hotel. She paid through the app and stepped out immediately, spotting 2 reporters waiting in the lobby. Somehow they had tracked her reservation. Ducking back into the car, she blurted, "Please, can you take me somewhere else? Anywhere." The driver nodded sympathetically, the first kindness she'd experienced since the flight, and pulled away from the curb. In the back seat, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her brother, Vic. Mom saw the videos. "She's upset. Said she didn't raise you to treat people that way." "Call her." For the first time since the incident, tears welled in Victoria's eyes. The carefully constructed facade of invulnerable success that had defined her for decades was crumbling completely, all because of one seat on one flight and the arrogant certainty that she could take what wasn't hers without consequences. As the car merged onto the freeway, heading nowhere in particular, Victoria Reynolds faced a truth she had spent her career helping clients avoid accountability. When it finally arrives, spares no one. Yet amid the ruins of her professional life, a small, unexpected seed of reflection took root. Perhaps she thought this humiliation was forcing her to see herself clearly for the first time in years. Not as the victim she'd cast herself as on that plane, but as someone whose pursuit of status had corrupted the very values that had once driven her to succeed. It would be a long road back if there was a road back at all. But it would begin with a phone call to her mother and an admission that had become impossible to deny she had been wrong. Elena Diaz stood at the podium in Conference Room A of Skylink's LAX Operations Center, facing a crowd that would have terrified her just hours earlier. The independent review committee, Skylink executives, media representatives, and fellow crew members who had responded to her call for witnesses. At 29, the junior flight attendant had never imagined becoming the focal point of a corporate revolution. Yet here she was, her Skylink uniform still crisp despite the long flight, her voice steady as she detailed what she had documented over 2 years of service. The instructions were never written down, Elena explained, scrolling through emails on the screen behind her. But during training, senior crew members would take newer flight attendants aside and explain the real policies for handling seating disputes. She highlighted a particular message from a trainer. Use your judgment with premium cabin guests. Some passengers might have the right ticket, but not understand our service standards. Find a diplomatic solution that keeps our highest value customers comfortable. This was code. Elena continued. We all understood it meant to prioritize passengers who looked the part of first class regardless of their actual ticket. Those who didn't fit that image, particularly people of color, younger travelers, or those dressed casually, were routinely questioned, challenged, or pressured to accept downgrades. Judge Williams, leading the review committee, leaned forward. Ms. Diaz, did you report these concerns through official channels? 17 times Elena confirmed advancing to a series of documented complaints she had filed. Each time I was told I was overthinking or being too sensitive. After the third complaint, my supervisor suggested it might affect my promotion opportunities if I continued to create problems. Elena's path to this moment had been anything but straightforward. The daughter of Mexican immigrants who had worked as airport custodial staff, she had grown up around aviation, watching passengers board planes to destinations her family could never afford to visit. When she finally achieved her dream of becoming a flight attendant, the reality behind the glamorous facade had been disillusioning. The incident with Mr. Blackwood today wasn't unusual. Elena continued. What was unusual was his refusal to accept the mistreatment and his ability to force accountability. She switched to a series of photographs, screenshots from her personal notes documenting similar incidents. September 14th. Black businessman in 2C asked to verify his boarding pass 3 times while white passengers boarded without checks. October 30th. Hispanic family assigned to first-class seats told there was a computer error and moved to economy. Seats given to standby passengers who better fit the cabin demographic. December 5th. Asian college student wearing sweatshirt repeatedly questioned about how she could afford her premium seat. Supervisor suggested offering her vouchers to voluntarily move to economy. With each example, the faces of the Skylink executives grew more strained. Evelyn Richardson, the board chairwoman, whispered urgently to Thomas Franklin, whose expression had shifted from defensive to devastated as the evidence mounted. After today's incident, I reached out to colleagues across Skylink's network. Elena said, her voice gaining strength. Within hours, 23 crew members from 16 different bases sent me similar documentation. This isn't isolated to one flight, one crew, or one airport. It's embedded in the culture. Officer Rodriguez, who had responded to the incident on Flight 1847, stepped forward when Elena acknowledged his presence. I can confirm similar patterns in security responses, he stated. When crew members call security for passenger removal, there's a clear demographic pattern to who gets reported versus who receives accommodation. I've documented this in my own reports for over a year. Rodriguez shared how his own background had shaped his approach to today's incident. As a second-generation Dominican-American who had faced profiling himself, he had made a personal commitment to fair enforcement, even when it meant questioning authority figures like Captain Bennett. Alexander Blackwood, seated quietly at the back of the room, watched the proceedings with focused attention. This was precisely why Protocol 7 existed, not just to address single incidents, but to create space for the fuller truth to emerge. Professor Abernathy from the review committee addressed the Skylink executives directly. You've heard the testimony. Do you dispute any of these documented incidents? Thomas Franklin, looking shell-shocked, could only shake his head. No, but I want to be clear that these practices were never official company policy. That distinction, Judge Williams noted dryly, offers little comfort to the passengers who experienced discrimination. Elena concluded her presentation by revealing her final piece of evidence, a recording from a training session where new flight attendants were explicitly told to use visual cues to identify passengers who might be in the wrong cabin and to prioritize the comfort of our typical premium passengers. The silence that followed was broken by Alexander Blackwood, who stood and addressed the room. Diaz, he said, his voice carrying easily without a microphone. Protocol 7 includes specific protections for whistleblowers. You will face no retaliation for your testimony today. In fact, I'm personally appointing you to head Skylink's new passenger advocacy office, reporting directly to the board of directors. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Elena herself looked stunned. "Your documentation may have saved this airline," Alex continued. "Not from public relations damage that's already done, but from continuing a pattern that degraded both passengers and the company's own values." He turned to the Skylink executives. "This is how change begins, not with press releases or diversity consultants, but with the courage of people like Elena Diaz who refused to look away." As Elena stepped down from the podium, surrounded by supportive colleagues who had likewise decided to come forward, she caught Alex's eye. The silent exchange communicated what both understood. Sometimes true leadership comes not from the executive suite, but from those who risk everything to stand for what's right. While Elena's testimony was reshaping Skylink from within, an unexpected development was forming in the terminal outside. Passengers from Flight 1847, many of whom had missed connections or delayed plans to provide statements to the review committee, had begun to congregate in a waiting area near Gate 54B. What started as casual conversation about their shared experience soon evolved into something more organized. Zoe Alvarez, the journalism student whose videos had helped catalyze the public response, found herself unofficially moderating a growing assembly of witnesses. "I've been flying for 30 years, said Robert Johnson, the businessman from Seat 2D, who had initially seemed irritated by the delay. "I've seen this kind of thing happen dozens of times, but I've never seen any real consequences. I watched it happen to my brother last year," added Maria Santiago, who had been seated in economy. The crew didn't believe he belonged in business class. He showed his boarding pass 3 times, and they still made him move. One by one, passengers began sharing not just what they had witnessed on Flight 1847, but their own experiences with discrimination in air travel. What had been individual grievances suddenly found collective voice. Zoe, recognizing the significance of the moment, started recording with permission. "Would you be willing to share these experiences as part of a documented pattern?" she asked the group. The response was overwhelmingly affirmative. Within an hour, what had begun as informal conversation had transformed into the nucleus of what would soon be called the Air Passenger Equity Coalition. Not everyone was on board with this development, however. A small but vocal group of passengers, led by a businessman who had been seated in first class, argued that the incident was being blown out of proportion. "Look what happened to Mr. Blackwood wasn't right," he admitted. "But destroying an entire airline over one bad judgment call seems excessive. People are losing their jobs over this." "That's exactly the point," countered an African-American woman who had been watching the scene unfold. "For decades, people of color have lost opportunities, dignity, and basic respect over one bad judgment call after another. The difference now is that someone with power is forcing consequences." The debate grew heated, reflecting the divisions forming online and in broader society. Some saw necessary accountability, others saw disproportionate punishment. This tension would define the conversation in the days and weeks to come. Evan Richardson, a civil rights attorney who happened to be on the flight, offered his business card. "This could form the basis for a class action suit," he explained. "Not just for today's incident, but for the pattern of discriminatory treatment across the industry." By late afternoon, the impromptu coalition had created a shared document of experiences, established a social media presence, and begun coordinating their statements to ensure the review committee received a comprehensive picture. News of the forming coalition reached Alexander Blackwood as he was concluding his meeting with the review committee. Gabriela Montez showed him the rapidly growing online forum where former Skylink passengers were now sharing their own experiences of discrimination. "This is expanding beyond Flight 1847, she noted. "People see an opportunity for their experiences to finally matter." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the point of Protocol 7, to transform individual incidents into collective action. Incorporate their testimonies into the official documentation." When Alex stepped into the waiting area where the coalition had gathered, the conversations quieted. Many had seen his confrontation with Victoria firsthand. Others had since learned of his role as the architect of Protocol 7. Mr. Blackwood Zoe greeted him. "We've been collecting testimonies from passengers who've experienced similar discrimination, not just on today's flight, but across multiple airlines in years." "That's valuable work," Alex acknowledged. Protocol 7 is designed to address patterns, not just isolated incidents. Robert Johnson stepped forward. "Some of us have been talking. We want to know what happens after the media moves on. What prevents Skylink from waiting out the storm and returning to business as usual?" It was the question at the heart of so many corporate scandals: how to ensure lasting change beyond the news cycle. Protocol 7 includes quarterly public reporting requirements for 3 years, Alex explained. Every discrimination complaint, every resolution published transparently. The airline can't simply wait for attention to fade. "And what about other airlines?" Maria Santiago asked. "Skylink isn't the only company with these issues." Alex smiled slightly. As of 2 hours ago, Protocol 7 has been adopted by Blackwood Global's investment portfolio, which includes significant stakes in 3 other major carriers. The standard is spreading. This revelation sparked excited murmurs throughout the group. What had begun as one man's stand for his rightful seat was expanding into an industry-wide reckoning. Evan Richardson approached with a proposal. "Mr. Blackwood, this coalition is organizing to ensure passengers have an ongoing voice in the reforms. Would you support our inclusion in the implementation of Protocol 7? "Not only would I support it," Alex replied, "I insist on it. Real change can't come solely from corporate boardrooms or independent committees. It must include the voices of those most affected." As Alex prepared to leave for his next meeting, Zoe asked one final question for her article. "Some people might say you had the power to make this stand because of your position. What about passengers who don't own airlines?" Alex considered the question carefully. "What happened today wasn't about power," he said finally. "It was about refusing to surrender dignity. Yes, my position amplified the consequences, but the principle remains the same for everyone. Your rights don't diminish because someone assumes you don't belong." He gestured to the coalition forming around them. "And this is how lasting change happens, not through individual power, but through collective witness. No one person can transform an industry, but together the truth becomes impossible to ignore." 6 days after Flight 1847 landed, a different kind of arrival occurred in Skylink's corporate headquarters. At precisely 9:00 a.m., a team of investigators from the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection entered the lobby, led by Deputy Director Rachel Martinez. "We're here to execute this formal investigation notice," Martinez announced to the startled receptionist presenting official documentation. "Please inform your executive team immediately." The speed of the federal response was unprecedented. Typically, DOT investigations took months to launch and years to complete. But the public nature of the Flight 1847 incident, combined with the mountain of evidence that had emerged under Protocol 7, had accelerated the process dramatically. Thomas Franklin met the team in the main conference room, accompanied by Skylink's general counsel and several visibly nervous executives. "The department takes allegations of discriminatory practices extremely seriously," Martinez began without preamble. "Based on preliminary evidence, we have reason to believe Skylink Airlines has engaged in a pattern of discriminatory conduct in violation of federal civil rights statutes and aviation regulations." She outlined the scope of the investigation: 3 years of passenger removal incidents, all bias complaints and their resolutions, crew training materials, and internal communications regarding passenger classification and treatment. "We'll need complete access to your records," she continued. "Any attempt to withhold or alter documentation will result in additional penalties." Franklin, looking considerably older than he had a week earlier, nodded in resignation. "We'll cooperate fully. Most of what you're requesting has already been compiled under Protocol 7. Martinez raised an eyebrow. Yes, the Blackwood Protocol. I must say, it's an extraordinary private accountability framework. Had it not existed, our investigation would be considerably more difficult. As the DOT team began setting up their temporary offices, news broke that the Federal Aviation Administration had launched a parallel investigation focused specifically on crew training and passenger removal procedures across all domestic carriers. By noon, a Congressional Oversight Committee announced public hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation with Alexander Blackwood, Elena Diaz, and Victoria Reynolds among those called to testify. The industry's response was immediate and self-protective. Airlines that had initially remained silent on the Skylink incident rushed to announce their own anti-discrimination initiatives. Pacific Airlines unveiled a passenger bill of rights guaranteeing equal treatment regardless of appearance or background. Atlantis Air announced mandatory monthly equity training for all customer-facing staff with third-party verification. Continental Express revealed a new transparent resolution system for all passenger complaints with quarterly public reporting. Industry analysts recognized these moves for what they were attempts to get ahead of regulatory action and avoid becoming the next Skylink. But regardless of motivation, the effect was the same rapid industry-wide changes to policies that had remained static for decades. In Washington, legislators from both parties recognized a rare opportunity for bipartisan action. Senator James Williams, chair of the Transportation Committee, announced new legislation, the Air Passenger Equity Act, establishing clear penalties for discriminatory practices and strengthening DOT's enforcement powers. What happened on Flight 1847 wasn't an isolated incident, Williams stated in a press conference. It was a glimpse into long-standing practices that have affected thousands of passengers. This legislation ensures that basic dignity isn't determined by how you look or what you're wearing. At Skylink headquarters, the DOT investigation team discovered something unexpected in their review of historical data. Numerous previous federal complaints had been filed against the airline for similar incidents, yet each had been resolved with minimal consequences. Small fines, confidential settlements, and promises of internal review that produced no measurable changes. The pattern is clear, Martinez noted in her preliminary report. Skylink treated regulatory penalties as a cost of doing business rather than an impetus for meaningful reform. Each settlement included non-disclosure agreements that prevented public awareness of the broader pattern. This finding led to an additional investigation by the Justice Department into whether Skylink had deliberately concealed evidence of discriminatory practices from federal regulators. By the end of the week, Skylink's stock had fallen 23% from its pre-incident value. Institutional investors began publicly questioning whether the current executive team could survive the compounding investigations. In a surprise development that shocked the business world, Victoria Reynolds broke her silence with an unexpected statement to the press. Standing before cameras with a humility never before seen in her public persona, she addressed not only her actions on Flight 1847 but their deeper implications. "What I did was wrong," she stated plainly. "There is no excuse, no justification, no mitigating circumstance that changes that fact. I took what wasn't mine because I believed I was entitled to it, and when challenged, I tried to use the system to punish the person who was actually in the right." Her candid admission of wrongdoing, rare in an era of carefully crafted non-apologies, captured public attention almost as much as the original incident. "The consequences I've faced are severe," she continued, "but they are also just. If we truly believe in accountability, it cannot be reserved only for those without power or privilege." Victoria's unexpected turn from villain to reluctant voice for accountability added yet another dimension to an already complex narrative. Some viewed it as genuine reflection, others as calculated image rehabilitation. But its timing alongside the federal investigations reinforced the sense that this story had moved far beyond a dispute over an airplane seat. It had become about the fundamental question of whether our system's corporate regulatory legal could meaningfully address the corrosive effects of bias and discrimination or whether they would continue protecting those who benefited from the status quo. As Alexander Blackwood had intended all along, Flight 1847 was becoming a test case not just for one airline, but for American institutions themselves. 1 month after Flight 1847, Alexander Blackwood stood at a podium in Skylink's newly renovated training center, addressing an audience that included flight crews, executives, regulatory officials, and media representatives. Behind him, a large screen displayed the logo of the newly established Air Travel Equality Foundation. Today marks not just a response to a crisis Alex began, but the beginning of a transformation. The foundation we're launching isn't about apologies or damage control. It's about building a new standard for how airlines serve all passengers, regardless of appearance, background, or prejudgment. He outlined the Foundation's core initiatives, focusing on their impact rather than technical details. First, the verification. First, protocol. In any seating or service dispute, crew members must verify documentation before making judgment calls. This simple step would have prevented what happened on Flight 1847. On screen, a training video demonstrated the new procedure, showing crew members checking boarding passes for both passengers in a seating dispute without assumptions or favoritism. Second, transparent complaint resolution. Every discrimination complaint will now be tracked through a public dashboard from initial report through final resolution. No more buried complaints or confidential settlements. The screen shifted to show a live dashboard where current complaints were displayed anonymously with their status and resolution clearly indicated. Third, independent oversight. The Passenger Advocacy Office, led by Elena Diaz, will report directly to the Board of Directors, with authority to investigate any crew member or executive who violates these protocols. Elena, seated in the front row in a new business suit rather than a flight attendant uniform, nodded as applause broke out. Fourth, community-informed training. All crew training will now include input from passengers who have experienced discrimination, ensuring that policies reflect real experiences rather than corporate assumptions. Several members of the Passenger Coalition, now formalized as an advisory board, were acknowledged in the audience. Fifth consequence, structures. Clear escalating consequences for bias incidents, from retraining for first offenses to termination for repeated violations. No more looking the other way. Former Captain Richard Bennett, who had been reinstated after completing intensive bias training and becoming an advocate for reform, stood to affirm this commitment. Sixth, technology solutions. Our new verification app ensures that seat assignments are confirmed, digitally removing subjective judgment from the process entirely. A demonstration showed how the app would work, scanning boarding passes and displaying seat assignments clearly. Finally, industry leadership. Skylink is publicly sharing all these protocols with other airlines, regulators, and consumer advocates. We don't view equality as a competitive advantage. It should be an industry standard. The response was a standing ovation, not just from Skylink employees, but from the DOT representatives, passenger advocates, and even competing airline executives who had come to learn from Skylink's transformation. After the presentation, Thomas Franklin, who had survived calls for his resignation by fully embracing the reforms, approached Alex privately. "When Protocol 7 first activated, I thought you were trying to destroy us," he admitted. "Now I understand you were trying to save us from ourselves." Alex nodded slightly. Sometimes true leadership means allowing necessary pain. Skylink couldn't change without first facing what it had become. As they spoke, the transformation was already taking tangible form throughout the company. New trainees were practicing the verification first protocol in simulated cabins. Elena Diaz was meeting with her growing team of passenger advocates. Officer Rodriguez, now heading security training for LAX, was implementing new guidelines for responding to crew requests for passenger removal. Most striking of all was the change in how crew members now interacted with passengers. The previously unwritten rules about who belonged in premium cabins had been replaced by a simple principle: the person with the correct boarding pass belongs in that seat regardless of appearance, attire, or manner. Yet not all reactions to these changes were positive. A vocal minority of longtime employees resisted what they viewed as excessive reform. Anonymous comments in industry forums complained about overcorrection and walking on eggshells. Some premium passengers expressed frustration at longer verification processes and what they perceived as diminished special treatment. These dissenting voices were not unexpected. Alex had always known that meaningful change would face resistance from those who benefited from the previous system. The key was ensuring that this resistance couldn't undermine or reverse the reforms once public attention inevitably moved on. That's why Protocol 7 had been designed with sustainability as its foundation, embedding new procedures and technology, regular public reporting, and independent oversight that didn't depend on any single champion or moment of crisis to maintain momentum. For Alex, watching these initiatives take shape, the satisfaction wasn't about vindication for his personal experience on Flight 1847. It was about transforming that moment into meaningful change for thousands of passengers who would never know his name, but who would travel with more dignity because he had refused to surrender his seat. The transformation within Skylink soon created ripples that extended far beyond a single airline. 3 months after Flight 1847, the effects were visible throughout the commercial aviation landscape. Pacific Airlines, initially quick to distance itself from Skylink's troubles, found itself facing uncomfortable questions when a video surfaced showing one of their flight attendants challenging a black passenger's first-class ticket. Unlike before the incident wasn't quietly resolved, it became national news within hours. The Flight 1847 effect, as industry analysts now called it, meant that incidents once handled through private apologies and vouchers were now subject to intense public scrutiny. Airlines could no longer rely on passenger fatigue or media disinterest to bury discriminatory practices. Recognizing the shifting terrain, Pacific's CEO made an unprecedented decision. He publicly adopted Protocol 7 for his own airline, acknowledging that the standards set by the Blackwood Protocol represent the future of accountable air travel. Within weeks, 3 other major carriers followed suit, creating what the Wall Street Journal termed a compliance arms race, as airlines competed to demonstrate their commitment to equitable treatment. The insurance industry, always sensitive to emerging liability patterns, began adjusting premiums based on airlines' anti-discrimination protocols. Carriers without transparent complaint resolution systems found themselves facing substantially higher rates, adding financial incentive to ethical considerations. Lloyd's of London, the world's largest aviation insurer, announced new underwriting guidelines that specifically referenced Protocol 7 components as risk reduction factors. Airlines demonstrating robust bias prevention systems qualify for premium reductions up to 15%. Their announcement stated effectively monetizing equality initiatives. International carriers, initially viewing the American controversy with detached interest, found themselves drawn into the conversation when global passengers began questioning their own policies. Emirates Airlines, Singapore Air, and Lufthansa all announced reviews of their training procedures, particularly for routes serving diverse passenger populations. The International Air Transport Association, IATA, representing 290 airlines worldwide, convened a special session on passenger equity standards. Their resulting guidelines borrowed heavily from Protocol 7, recommending verification-first approaches and transparent complaint resolution for all member airlines. Within the technology sector, several startups developed tools specifically designed to support the new standards. Verification apps, anonymous reporting platforms, and data analytics systems for identifying potential bias patterns attracted significant venture capital funding. ClearSeat, a passenger rights app that allowed travelers to document discrimination in real time, reached 1 million downloads within its first month. Its founder, a former airline executive, explicitly credited the Flight 1847 incident as his inspiration. Even Victoria Reynolds, whose career had ended at Blackwell & Turner, found an unexpected path forward. After a period of public silence and private reflection, she emerged as a corporate ethics speaker, using her own experience as a cautionary tale about entitlement and accountability. "I became the face of privilege weaponized," she told a conference of legal professionals in her first public appearance. "My actions on that flight revealed biases I had refused to acknowledge in myself. The consequences were severe but necessary." In a surprising twist, Victoria and Alexander Blackwood appeared together on a panel discussing corporate accountability. Their conversation, respectful, candid, and without rancor, demonstrated that even the most contentious conflicts could yield constructive dialogue when accountability was accepted rather than deflected. "Ms. Reynolds and I will never be friends," Alex acknowledged during their joint appearance, "but we share a belief that our systems must change. Sometimes it takes experiencing both sides of an injustice to see the full picture." Victoria nodded in agreement. "I lost everything because I believed rules applied differently to people like me. That belief wasn't random. It was reinforced by countless experiences where I watched systems bend for certain people and remain rigid for others. The difference is that I used that observation to seize advantage rather than working to change the pattern." Their unprecedented reconciliation, not personal but professional, added another dimension to the ongoing national conversation about privilege, accountability, and institutional change. For Officer Rodriguez, the security officer whose insistence on verifying both boarding passes had been a crucial turning point, professional recognition came in the form of a new role. The TSA appointed him to lead a specialized training unit focused on equitable security practices, using the Flight 1947 incident as a case study in bias prevention. Elena Diaz's Passenger Advocacy Office became a model studied by consumer protection agencies worldwide. Her team's quarterly reports, published transparently as required by Protocol 7, provided unprecedented visibility into complaint patterns and resolutions. Perhaps most significantly, passenger behavior itself began to change. Travelers became more willing to document and report discriminatory treatment, knowing that accountability mechanisms now existed. The passive resignation that had once characterized responses to unfair treatment was giving way to informed advocacy. As Alexander Blackwood observed these developments from his Manhattan office, he recognized that Protocol 7 had evolved beyond his original design. It had become a movement, one that continued to grow beyond his direct influence. "The true test of change," he noted in a rare interview, "isn't what happens when someone powerful is watching. It's what happens when no one is watching at all. We're still far from that point, but we're moving in the right direction." 1 month after the establishment of the Air Travel Equality Foundation, tangible results were already becoming visible across Skylink's operations. The Passenger Experience Metrics, a data dashboard now publicly available on the airline's website, showed remarkable improvements. Discrimination complaints had decreased by 72% compared to the previous quarter. Verification compliance crew members, following the Check First protocol, had reached 98.7%. Passenger satisfaction scores among minorities and underrepresented groups had increased by 27%. Employee reporting of witnessed bias incidents had increased sixfold, indicating a culture shift away from silence. But beyond the statistics, the changes were evident in the daily operations that passengers experienced directly. At JFK's Terminal 4, Sandra Martinez, a newly trained Skylink gate agent, demonstrated the verification first protocol when 2 passengers claimed the same seat in business class. Without assumptions or favoritism, she calmly verified both boarding passes, identified the correct passenger, and resolved the situation without escalation. Before Protocol 7, there was always this unspoken pressure to side with the passenger who looked right for premium cabins, she explained to a Wall Street Journal reporter observing the interaction. "Now we have clear procedures that remove that subjective judgment. It's actually made our jobs easier." On a transcontinental flight passenger, Jason Williams, a black executive who flew weekly for business, noticed the difference immediately when he boarded in first class. The crew greeted me the same way they greeted everyone else, he noted. That shouldn't be remarkable, but after years of being asked to verify my seat while watching others walk right by the change is significant. In Skylink's Atlanta training facility, new flight attendants now participated in scenario-based training led by members of the passenger coalition people who had experienced discrimination firsthand and could articulate its impact. "We're not here to shame or blame," explained Robert Johnson, the businessman from Flight 1847, who had become an active coalition member. "We're here to help crew members understand how seemingly small interactions can communicate powerful messages about who belongs and who doesn't." Elena Diaz, now a senior executive whose office overlooked the operations center, had assembled a diverse team of advocates who reviewed every reported incident within 24 hours. Their findings and recommendations were published weekly, creating unprecedented transparency. The most significant change Elena observed is that crew members now understand that looking the other way isn't an option. Accountability isn't punitive, it's how we improve. Perhaps most telling was the transformation in Captain Richard Bennett, whose initial defense of bias had given way to passionate advocacy for change. After completing comprehensive training and demonstrating genuine commitment to equity, he had been reinstated not just as a pilot but as the head of crew training for the entire airline. "I spent 30 years believing I treated everyone fairly," Bennett told a class of new hires. "Flight 1847 forced me to confront the gap between my intentions and my actions." That's the journey we're all on, recognizing that bias often operates below our conscious awareness. For Skylink's executive team, the shift went beyond policy to fundamental business strategy. The quarterly earnings call included for the first time metrics on equity and inclusion, alongside financial results treating fair treatment as a core performance indicator rather than a separate initiative. Thomas Franklin addressing shareholders with a humility that would have been unimaginable before Flight 1847 acknowledged that the company was still early in its transformation. "We don't claim to have solved these deeply ingrained issues in just 1 month," he stated. "But we have committed to measuring them, addressing them transparently, and holding ourselves accountable for continuous improvement." The most visible symbol of change came in an unlikely form. Seat 1A on every Skylink aircraft now featured a small discreet plaque with the words, "Dignity is non-negotiable," engraved below the seat number. It served as a quiet reminder of the incident that had catalyzed an industry-wide awakening. Alexander Blackwood had visited Skylink's headquarters only once since the establishment of the foundation, preferring to let the reforms develop their own momentum without his constant oversight. His philosophy was clear. True, change couldn't depend on one person's continued vigilance. But the systems he had designed through Protocol 7 continued working as intended, creating transparency where there had been secrecy, accountability where there had been denial, and improvement where there had been stagnation. 1 month was too soon to declare victory over patterns that had developed over decades. But it was long enough to demonstrate that change was possible when the cost of discrimination finally exceeded the cost of addressing it. 3 months after Flight 1847, the bright lights of the 60-minute studio shone down on Alexander Blackwood's calm yet resolute face. Behind him, a large screen displayed the now iconic moment Victoria Reynolds exposed with a boarding pass marked Seat 14F. The entire first-class cabin frozen in stunned silence. Mr. Blackwood began veteran host Diane Foster. "Millions want to know, why didn't you just accept another seat? It was only a chair after all." Alex drew in a deep breath. His response, when it came, resonated with the quiet intensity that had defined his actions that day on the plane. "It was never just a chair," he said. "It was dignity. Every time we surrender to injustice, just to keep the peace, we feed a system that survives on silence. And I decided silence was no longer an option." The camera panned to the wall behind him, covered with dozens of letters from teachers, nurses, factory workers, students, flight attendants, and countless others who had experienced similar moments of being diminished, but who had found new courage in the aftermath of Flight 1847. These letters, Alex explained, gesturing to the wall, represent the real impact of what happened, not the stock price fluctuations or the corporate restructuring, but the conversations that are happening in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across the country. The screen behind them changed to display the most surprising development since the incident footage of Alex and Victoria Reynolds sitting down for a private conversation away from cameras and reporters. The meeting had been Victoria's request, and Alex had agreed with one condition that they meet in Seat 1A on an empty Skylink aircraft. That meeting wasn't about forgiveness, Alex explained as viewers saw the two of them in serious conversation. It was about understanding. Ms. Reynolds wanted to explain what had led her to act as she did that day, and I wanted her to hear directly from me what that experience meant. Was it difficult to sit across from someone who had tried to have you removed from a plane? Diane asked. Less difficult than you might imagine, Alex replied thoughtfully. Because by then we had both recognized that we were products of the same broken system. She had been trained to expect deference regardless of right, and I had been trained to expect resistance despite it. The difference was how we responded to that training. The interview cut to footage of Elena Diaz addressing a congressional hearing on airline passenger rights. Her testimony, calm and factual, detailed the cultural patterns that had enabled discriminatory practices to continue unchecked for decades. Elena Diaz has become something of a folk hero, Diane noted when the studio camera returned. Many say her courage in coming forward was as important as your confrontation on the flight. Alex nodded emphatically. More important, I'd argue. My experience on Flight 1847 was a single incident. Elena documented years of pattern and practice. I had the platform to make people listen, but she had the knowledge to tell them what they needed to hear. The screen behind them changed to display the Air Travel Equality Foundation's public dashboard, showing real-time statistics on verified incidents, resolutions, and passenger satisfaction metrics across participating airlines. We cannot allow justice to become a luxury reserved for the few. Alex continued, each word measured and deliberate. We cannot let a so-called reasonable solution always mean the victim must sacrifice. Justice isn't negotiable. Dignity isn't a privilege. The studio audience sat in rapt attention. Some nodded in agreement, others dabbed at tears. After everything that's happened, Diane asked, what would you say to people watching who might find themselves in similar situations, but who don't have your resources or platform? Alex's answer came not from prepared notes or careful calculation, but from the hard-won wisdom of someone who had transformed personal injustice into collective progress. Remember this, he said, the most powerful seat is not in first class. It is on the moral ground where you stand. Never give up the place you deserve, because sometimes one refusal of injustice can change the world. As the interview concluded, the camera followed Alex as he walked across the studio to where Victoria Reynolds waited in the wings. The two nodded to each other, not friends, but no longer adversaries, united in an unlikely alliance that symbolized how accountability, when genuinely embraced, could transform even the most bitter conflicts into opportunities for meaningful change. 6 months after Flight 1847, Alexander Blackwood stood before 200 students at Howard University's Business School auditorium, the inaugural class of the Air Travel Equality Foundation Scholarship Program. These young people, selected from communities historically underrepresented in aviation leadership, represented the long-term vision behind Protocol 7, not just reformed policies, but a transformed industry. Your presence here today, Alex began, represents the true legacy of what began on Flight 1847. Not just reformed policies or accountability frameworks, but a new generation that will lead with an innate understanding that dignity and fairness aren't add-ons to good business. They are good business. The students listened intently as Alex shared not the public story they all knew, but the personal journey that had led to Protocol 7's creation. I developed Protocol 7 after decades of experiencing what many of you have experienced, being questioned, challenged, or diminished in spaces where others moved freely. The difference wasn't that I faced less bias. It was that I eventually gained the power to address it structurally rather than individually. He gestured to Elena Diaz, now Executive Vice President of Passenger Advocacy at Skylink, who sat alongside Officer Rodriguez, recently promoted to Director of Equitable Security Practices at the TSA. Both had become mentors in the scholarship program, translating their experiences into guidance for the next generation. As Alex concluded his remarks, the doors at the back of the auditorium opened, revealing an unexpected guest, Victoria Reynolds. Her presence caused a ripple of whispers among the students, many of whom recognized her immediately from the viral videos. The woman who had once symbolized entitlement and privilege now walked slowly to the front of the room, her expression a mixture of humility and resolve. When she reached the podium, she and Alex exchanged a brief nod, the same gesture they had shared on 60 Minutes, conveying mutual recognition without pretense of friendship. "I wasn't invited here today," Victoria began, her voice steady but less commanding than in her previous life. "I asked to come because your education as future leaders won't be complete without understanding both sides of accountability." She looked out at the sea of faces, young people who would enter an industry that had been fundamentally changed by her actions, and Alex's response to them. "Most of you know me as the villain in this story," she continued, "and rightfully so. What I did was wrong. But what you may not realize is that I believed I was entitled to act that way because for my entire professional life, systems had bent for me while remaining rigid for others." Victoria didn't seek sympathy or forgiveness. Instead, she offered something more valuable: insight into how privilege operates and blinds those who benefit from it. "The hardest lesson I've learned is that what feels like merit is often privilege in disguise. I believed I deserved special treatment because I'd worked hard, never recognizing how many barriers had been removed from my path while being placed in others." As Victoria finished her unexpected remarks and took a seat in the audience, Alex returned to the podium. Their coordinated appearance not planned for publicity or image rehabilitation, but as an educational tool for future leaders, represented something rare in American public life adversaries who had found common purpose not in personal reconciliation, but in structural change. "The measure of lasting change," Alex concluded, "isn't what I did in seat 1A that day. It's what you will do in the countless moments of choice that lie ahead in your careers. Will you stand firm when it would be easier to stay silent? Will you verify before assuming? Will you create systems where doing the right thing becomes the default rather than the exception?" As the students rose in a standing ovation, Alex felt the weight of that day on Flight 1847 finally lifting. What had begun as a confrontation over a seat had evolved into something far more significant, a movement that continued to grow beyond any single person or incident. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, let this story remind you, your seat is earned, not requested. Your dignity is non-negotiable. And sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to move when justice is on your side, because change doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks calmly down the aisle, stands its ground, and transforms everything. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of transformation and accountability. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dignity matters. And leave a comment below with your own experiences standing up for what's right. Remember, one person's refusal to accept injustice can spark a movement that changes the world.